Please welcome Hui Tsai, Program Chair, VP and Head of Content, WuXi Aptech, to open the 2022 WuXi Healthcare Forum.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to WuXi Healthcare Forum 2022. This year's theme is Call to Action. We are inspired by the World Health Organization's call for urgent and concerted efforts on global health challenges. We are proud to bring together more than 50 million voices at the forefront of tackling non-communicable diseases, antimicrobial resistance, and diseases that are uniquely challenging for lower and middle-income countries. At WuXi Aptech, helping patients in need and contributing to the global healthcare ecosystem are the driving forces behind everything we do. We also believe that global challenges require global solutions and global collaborations. We take deep pride in supporting global innovators through our R&D enabling platform, and we hope discussions this week at the forum will catalyze more innovative solutions among many of us in audience today. I would like to thank our esteemed speakers for your wonderful support. Thank our supporting partners, UK Bioindustry Association, BioCentury, Biocom California, California Life Sciences, Clarivet, Endpoints News, Genetic Engineering and Biotechnology News, MBC Biolabs, Medical Valley Alliance, Pharma Intelligence, Informa, Swiss Biotech Association, and thank you everyone for participating in this important discussion. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Steve Yang, co-CEO of WuXi Aptech, to deliver our forum's opening remark.
Please welcome Steve Yang, co-CEO, WuXi Aptech, for his opening remarks.
Dear colleagues and friends, I am excited to welcome you all to WuXi Healthcare Forum 2022. It is a great honor to host such a diverse group of panelists and participants who share the same passion for science and dedication to improving the lives of patients. Over the last few years, we have witnessed, and for many of us played a part in advancing global solutions to some of the world's toughest healthcare challenges, including the coronavirus pandemic. Yet, as we all know, many more challenges remain. As my colleague Hui mentioned, the theme of this year's forum is Call to Action. We are here to support the World Health Organization's key initiatives and explore ways that we across the innovation ecosystem can collaboratively tackle heart disease, cancer, dementia, and other life-threatening illness impacting patients around the world. Before we start today's discussion, I would like to take a moment to reflect on the kind of solutions that can help us rise to the challenges facing patients and our society. First, we need solutions that are innovative and actionable. New modalities, new delivery technologies, new opportunities to work together, all of these elements lay the foundation for the future of the healthcare innovation. It is essential that we translate our expertise and innovative ideas into tangible solutions and treatments for patients. Second, we need solutions that foster collaborations across the industry and across the sectors. By working together, we can accelerate R&D innovation and medical breakthroughs for patients all over the world. One of the goals of this forum is to forge lasting partnerships, and we hope you are able to form such connections over the next few days. Last, but certainly not least, we need solutions that can address the needs of patients around the globe. During this 3-day forum, we will hear from more than 50 global science, healthcare, and technology leaders, including top executives from the life science industries and non-government organizations, preeminent researchers, emerging entrepreneurs, and other key stakeholders. Each of them has a unique story of how they have forged new paths for scientific discovery and pave the way for a better life for patients and their families. As a part of a global healthcare community, we are very proud to support the work of our partners and look forward to working with many of you in the years ahead. Thank you to all our panelists and to everyone joining from around the world. I look forward to the many exciting discussions we will have over the next few days and beyond.
The World Health Organization has called for an urgent increase in actions to address the epidemic of non-communicable diseases such as cancer, lung and heart disease, which collectively account for 71% of all deaths globally. What have we learned from improving R&D productivity for complex chronic diseases? How can different modalities and technological innovations further improve our efficiency and effectiveness in helping patients? Can we reverse, prevent, and cure chronic diseases in the next decade? Please welcome Sir Menelaos Pangalos, EVP and President, Biopharmaceuticals R&D, AstraZeneca, and Steve Yang, Co-CEO, WuXi Healthcare.
Sir Mene, it is a great pleasure for me to welcome you to the WuXi Healthcare Forum 2022. And it is wonderful to hear your insight and catching up. Complex chronic disease. Clearly, this is something, a major theme of this year's WuXi Healthcare Forum. Let's start with clearly something that really has an impact to our industry. In the past decade, under your leadership, AstraZeneca has transformed your pipeline and approach to R&D. And what have you learned on changing productivity and mitigate risk in biopharmaceuticals?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. I think if there was one message I would focus on, it's to focus on the quality of your pipeline, not on the quantity of your pipeline or the volume of your pipeline. If you look at our success rates as an industry, they're very low. The average now is around 7-8%. So then that's from when you have a candidate drug, you've completed, you're doing GLP tox and trying to get yourself through clinical development. So it means we're failing 92% of the time. I mean, we're very good at failing. And AstraZeneca from 2005 to 2010 was even better at failing than anybody else, because if you measured our success rate was around 4%. And so we were failing, 96% of the time. So it really was not very good. And that's with a budget we were spending, I think, about $5 billion a year. So looking at all of our data and looking at what other companies have done as well, we focused on 5 things. The first is understanding the biology of what we work on and really making sure that we work on fewer things, but in areas where we can really dig deeper into the biology and constantly try to disprove or prove our scientific hypothesis. The second was something that we call right tissue, which is around defining how much you need to inhibit your target of interest in the tissue of interest. So let's say you've got to inhibit a receptor in the heart. Show me how much I have to block it by, right? Is it 80%? Is it 90%? Is it for 6 hours? Is it for 24 hours? And demonstrate me a way that I can measure that in animals and then ultimately in people as well. And that enables you to demonstrate proof of mechanism. And that's important because when your programs fail, and as you know, as I said earlier, we fail a lot. You want to know that you failed, but you've tested your scientific hypothesis, because then at least you've learned something from your experiment.
Yep.
The third of our 5 R's was right safety. That's defining and understanding your safety signals. When you pick a target, what are the risks? How do you try and mitigate those risks early on in research? Because what we found out was that when you had a safety risk, it tended to get worse as you moved further along. It never went away, it just got worse and more expensive. Yep. And so weeding out safety risks early on saves you a lot of money and a lot of time, and then again enables you to focus on programs that have got a better chance of being successful. The fourth of the 5 R's was right patient, defining the patient population that has the best chance of responding to your mechanism. because if your drug doesn't work in that population, it's not going to work in a broader population. And then the fifth R was right commercial. And by right commercial, I don't mean is it going to be $1 billion revenue drug. I mean, why would anyone want to prescribe the drug, and why would anyone want to reimburse the drug? And therefore think about what experiments you have to do in the laboratory in terms of the comparators that you use, and in the clinic in terms of the comparators you use, because you have to ultimately project when your drug launches, if it's successful, what will it be being compared to? And it's not today's standard of care, it's tomorrow's standard of care. And so thinking about those comparisons through your development is, I think, very, very important. All of those things together helped us change our culture. We've gone from a 4% success rate now to we're almost up at 30%. So we're kind of one of the best performing companies in the industry. I think in 2012 to 2016, we'd got above 20%. And now if you look at our success rates, and obviously with the COVID work that we've done as well, our success rates have gone up. So we're now sort of in the sort of high 20s, low 30s, depending on the therapy area and what we're doing. So we still do very well, and we're still very good at failing. So we still fail much more than we succeed. You know, we fail 70% of the time now. But I think it's a much healthier place to be. And I think you've got to be careful not to push it too hard, because if you're not failing, you know, a good amount, you're probably not trying to innovate enough. Now, what I would say, Steve, is the reason why we fail now is very different to the reason why we failed from 2005 to 2010. If I look at the work that we did from 2012 to 2016, when we looked at the next round of our success rates, we weren't failing anymore because we had lousy chemistry. We weren't failing for safety. We weren't failing because we weren't demonstrating proof of mechanism or showing good PK/PD. We were failing because we don't understand the diseases well enough.
Yeah, it's now back to the disease, complex disease biology.
Exactly right. It's back to disease complexity.
Complex chronic disease. Clearly, this is something, a major theme of this year's WuXi Healthcare Forum. So what is your view on the future of biopharmaceutical innovation and its impact for patients, especially for this complex chronic disease?
Yeah, so it's a great question. Of course, it's great treating rare diseases, it's great treating cancer, but we're talking about thousands or a few million patients versus the billions of patients that suffer from cardiovascular disease, diabetes, lung disease, etc. I think what we're trying to do in chronic diseases is really break them down into subsets of diseases. Diseases generally are quite heterogeneous, whether you look at NASH or chronic kidney disease or asthma and COPD. And so trying to find subtypes of patients within a broad chronic disease class, either using genetics or biomarkers, is helping us try to define the right patient again for the right mechanism. And actually, when you look at the molecule that we have in development now, which is targeting a cytokine called IL-33, we're trying to find a subset of patients through their genetics and through their biomarkers that are more likely to respond to an anti-IL-33, let's say, than an anti-IL-5. And then you have other programs like tezepelumab, which is an anti-TSLP, which seems to be able to work in a broader population. But we're trying each time to define the patient population that's most likely to respond to a particular drug. But we're also investing very heavily in genomics, Steve, as you know, to sequence several million genomes, because by looking for rare variants of disease that either protect or cause disease, you can get better insights into some of the pathways that may be important in driving slightly broader, more chronic diseases. And we have, you know, many examples. To give you an example, you know, ApoL1 in chronic kidney disease, right? That's a very specific polymorphism in a gene that's actually a gene that protects us from trypanosome infections. But we know that it makes people vulnerable, particularly African Americans, to chronic kidney disease, and they have a much poorer prognosis if they have some of these risk alleles. So it basically gives us an insight into a subset of patients with chronic kidney disease and a way of targeting them specifically by going after the
right patient.
It's going after the right patient, exactly right.
So with so many new insight using genomics and human genetics, you can now have precision medicine type of approach. And obviously, this also, the type of targets and the disease biology probably requires different modalities. So
Exactly right.
what's your view on the conversion across different molecules, modalities, hardwares, and software innovation for improving patient outcomes?
Yeah,
Since your R&D organization, if I look at your R&D presentation, it encompasses so many different modalities and a different approach in combination.
It's a great question, Steve, and it goes back to, again, if you think about why was it important. When I first started in AstraZeneca in 2010, we were basically a small molecule and antibody group, and actually we were predominantly small molecules with antibodies starting to grow. If you look at us today, we probably have 12 or 15 different drug modalities that our scientists can use, ranging from cell therapies to antisense or oligonucleotides or siRNAs to messenger RNA to PROTACs to anticalins, Fab fragments, ADC. I mean, you name it. We have a lot of different platforms, and the reason we have so many different platforms is because as you start to work in more unbiased ways on understanding the complexities of the disease that we work in and ultimately the genetics of the disease that we work in, we start to come up with targets where if all you have is small molecules and antibodies, you basically have to stop because there's no way of targeting them. And we've come up now, and I think kind of it gives you a sense as to the level of innovation. We come up with targets every year where there's only one paper in the literature, and it's a paper that basically describes the gene but doesn't know what it does, and hasn't related to the disease that we're interested in, for example. And so there, by having a variety of technologies, that it enables your scientists to still prosecute that target and that biology. So I think it's incredibly important that we have a broad set of tools that enable us to go after any target, whether it's an RNA sequence or DNA sequence, whether it's a transcription factor, whether it's a kinase, a receptor, intracellular, extracellular, whatever it happens to be. And so that becomes very, very important. The other piece that I think has changed quite dramatically, and this is really more recent over the past 5 years, is how we use artificial intelligence and high power computing to enable our scientists to make better decisions and to be more efficient and effective. And the analogy, if you just think about, I mean, I know there's lots of scientists from pharma watching this video, but think about, your favorite target or the favorite area that you work in, whether it's in heart failure or kidney disease or cancer, and you think about this one target in that space, and you think about how many papers get published every day, how many patents get published every day, how many presentations happen at conferences every week or month. And it's impossible for any single scientist to keep on top of all of that information. And that's just if they focus on, let's say, if you're working on EGFR receptors, you'll just be focusing on lung cancer. But think about all of the EGFR papers that are happening in kidney disease and heart failure and Alzheimer's disease. And so by being able to create systems and use AI to basically put all of that information that's coming out every day together into what we call now knowledge graphs, so that we can actually look at everything that comes out and put it into a format that our science can start to look at patterns and generate insights in what I like is a very unbiased way. So it doesn't have also the bias that the scientist has of this is my favorite area, or this is the disease, or this is the pathway I like. We're coming up with a lot of very novel insights that you wouldn't otherwise come into. And then you need the insight of the scientists and the chemists and the physicians to take that and use judgment as to what to work on first.
You generate new hypotheses based on
to generate new hypotheses, and then of course as you generate data, that all goes back into the knowledge graphs, and you update them, and so they're living databases and living graphs. And it's the same in chemistry. If you think about synthetic routes or designing molecules, using computers now to help you think about what the best options are, and not the easiest ones, but actually the best ones that are most likely to yield you the most potent compounds, the most tractable compounds, the best the most stable compounds, and then thinking about using computers we're now using to design our synthetic routes, because I'd rather come up with my CDs not having 21 synthetic steps, but 8 synthetic steps, because it's a lot more cost effective. The computers, I think, and AI-based design are really helping us now across biology, chemistry. They're helping us in the clinic. It's really helping us everywhere. And it's not about replacing scientists. It's about aiding scientists to make better decisions.
Yeah. So it's man plus machines and
man plus machines. Exactly right. Man plus machines
and algorithms. So this is obviously a great way to look into the future. So with those learning and the new technologies, particularly the learnings from the pandemic. So how do you see our industry, the biopharmaceutical innovation, evolving in the coming 10 years? So let's say 10 years from now, if I visit you in Cambridge, we have a chat, we should probably do that. So what will we talk about? What type of innovation will we thinking about at that time, in 10 years time?
So I think the AI-based design, AI in everything that we do, whether it's biology, chemistry, clinic, patient selection, I think that will be everywhere, right? We're going to have scientists that are comfortable with data and are working with data scientists in a way that basically becomes seamless. I think you're going to see a lot more gene therapies and cell therapies. I think in my area, in the non-oncology areas of AZ, I think you're going to start to see a lot more therapies that are going after reversal of disease or curing of disease, not just treatment of disease. So I think some of the things I'm seeing around CRISPR gene editing, base editing, cell therapies, I think is regenerative therapies is very, very interesting and exciting. I think, programmable therapies, we've seen it with the vaccines, with mRNAs and with adenoviral-based vectors, but it's true now, again, across disease areas, you're going to see many more programmable type therapies, which have been antisense oligonucleotides, siRNAs, mRNAs being applied across a broad set of diseases. And actually, I think mRNA is going to evolve to self-amplifying mRNA, which means lower dose, lower cost, and easier to do over chronic use versus acute use in vaccines. And then I think we're also going to be using a lot more the way we conduct clinical studies, how we've had to adapt to a digital world during the pandemic is also changed a little bit how we all work, right? We wouldn't be doing this like this 2 years ago, but we'd also be running our clinical trials very differently. We'd be distributing our drug substance very differently to a site versus straight to a patient. So I think all of those types of things will continue to evolve, making us hope more efficient. And I hope ultimately our industry just becomes more efficient. I think, we're still, relatively unproductive. And so I think our industry needs to continue to improve. But it's a great time, I think, to be a scientist, because I think we're uncovering a lot of new disease understanding, a lot of new pathways, and there's capabilities now that can really have us starting to dream about cure and reversal of disease versus just treatment. It's not so far away, I think, in some areas.
So in another word, some of the chronic disease that you are working on could become even, be modified or, as you described, even reversed.
I hope so. I think that's what we have a catchphrase that we use, which is called "Life Without Limits." We want to turn chronic illness, people with chronic illness, to be able to live their lives normally, not impaired or impeded in any way. And to do that, obviously you have to have good treatments and you can stop disease, but I think the real goal now is to see if we can reverse disease, regenerate tissue, and then even cure.
Thank you, Sir Mane. It's a great opportunity to catching up and hear your insight at the WuXi Healthcare Forum 2022.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you for having me.
Many lower and middle-income countries that lack the traditional biopharma R&D models and commercial markets often face a unique set of challenges in addressing infectious diseases like tuberculosis and malaria. How can we close the gap through innovative R&D partnership models and address global healthcare concerns in lower and middle income countries? Please welcome Emilio Amini, CEO, Bill and Melinda Gates Medical Research Institute, and Zina Afas-Bes, Deputy Head, Healthcare Private Equity, AXA Investment Managers Group.
Hello, Emilio. It is a real pleasure to be having this conversation with you today. I'm delighted to be discussing a topic that's at the core of the work that we're doing at AXA Investment Managers in investing in global health, so that we can bring innovative healthcare solutions from high-income countries and bridging to bring those products to high-volume markets. So I really wanted to take this opportunity to discuss with you how innovators and entrepreneurs can work with you at the Gates Medical Research Institute to enable partnerships that ultimately will lead to enhanced worldwide access to hugely needed healthcare products. So to start with, and for delegates who are not so familiar with the Institute, would you please tell us a little bit more about the origination, nature, and mission of the Gates MRI?
Yes, well, Zina, thank you very much. And it's my pleasure to be here with you today. So the Gates Medical Research Institute started a little over 4 years ago as a fully owned affiliate, and still is a fully owned affiliate, of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And the reason why the Institute was put together is that it became evident that there are certainly a fair number of, I'll call them interventions, that whether they be diagnostics, vaccines, novel drugs, things of that nature, that where the market, if you want to use that term, is exclusively in and among populations of lower and middle income countries. And the important consideration there is that we're talking exclusively in lower and middle income countries, right? So just a couple of diseases, things like tuberculosis, malaria, things of that nature. And the challenge, of course, is that the biopharmaceutical development of these interventions is a challenge for your traditional biopharma companies, simply because, as you all know, development is high risk, it is fairly resource intensive, and developing a product for which there is no true high-income country commercial market is very difficult for the innovative biopharma industry. So the Institute was started as a way of sort of filling that gap to provide the ability to drive the development of these interventions in a way in which a biopharma company would actually drive that development, right? But it would be independent of the biopharma company, right? And would be developed specifically, again, for products where the primary market or the primary use is in lower and middle income country populations.
Okay, that's super interesting. And maybe I'm curious to learn, how is the Gates MRI actually funded? And how does the Institute actually work as this operational development organization?
Well, in terms of our funding, at the moment, we're a fully owned affiliate of the Gates Foundation, and we are fully funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So that's where our full funding comes from. As a development organization, we look like any other biopharma development organization. We have a clinical development function, we have CMC, we have regulatory and all of the support functions, clinical operations functions, and we have the full ability and we have all of the infrastructure that is required to do this work in a fully regulated environment. So we are a full development organization, right? And it's now, most of the work that we do through partners, all right? Mostly, contract manufacturing organizations, contract research organizations. But it's not as if we simply hand it over to the partner to do it. It is literally a partnership, right? The work gets done by the contract organizations, but it's fully supervised and fully managed by the Institute.
Okay, so I'm just wondering how the Gates MRI objectives have maybe evolved since the launch a few years ago, in terms of stage of development of products, types of products, so devices, therapeutics. Are there particular areas of higher interest than others? And then weightings in terms of the disease areas. Of course, we know it's TB, malaria, diarrheal diseases, maternal, newborn, and child, but are there particular weightings that have come through the evolution since launch?
When the Institute was first founded, one of the original concepts was that the Institute was going to be I guess I'll call it a translational, medical research organization. So one in which we would do sort of phase 2 translational studies. So it was originally founded to sort of fill in that gap for, again, products that or interventions primarily of interest in low and middle income countries. It became evident very quickly thereafter that not only do we have that first valley of death, but there's also a second valley of death, which is to do the full phase 3 development, right? So and in fact, it's very difficult to separate those two pieces. So we put it all together, and that's how we've evolved. In terms of the areas in which we work in, because we're a fully owned affiliate of the foundation, the areas that we work in are predominantly those areas of primary interest to the foundation. Right?
Yeah.
But again, these are the ones that you just mentioned, right? Tuberculosis, malaria, maternal and neonatal child health, areas such as enteric diseases, the novel vaccines for enteric diseases that afflict populations, again, low-income countries.
Yeah, you've actually taken me to my next question, which would have been sort of, do you see more programs in particular areas? Do you see any particular gaps that you'd love entrepreneurs and innovators to try to focus on and to fill those gaps?
Well, if you take a look at disease areas like tuberculosis and malaria, there are gaps all over the place, aren't there? TB was the world's largest #1 infectious disease killer, right? 1.5 million people a year. And it is still 1.5 to almost, latest set of numbers was 1.7 million people, succumb to TB disease. And so novel diagnostics are required. Definitely a vaccine to prevent, progression, either prevent infection with Mycobacterium tuberculosis, or certainly prevent the progression to the development of active tuberculosis is important. Malaria still remains a significant issue. In young children in many low-income countries, as you know, where malaria is endemic, we're looking at, 500,000 to more than 500,000 deaths per year, right? I mean, these are very large numbers. Same thing is true for enteric diseases. So those are the areas in which we're focused and in which we work. Now the markets for anything that's successfully developed for these for these populations are going to be your classic as you said earlier, Zena, high volume by definition, but largely single payer, right? Because usually there will be single payers for the use of these interventions. And low margin products, right? So in essence, when you think about it, we take on the full risk for the development of those products, because like any other development program, it may not be successful in the end, right? So that's the risk that we take on. If it is successful, it then becomes easier for that back-end commercializer to pick up the product, right? And then to supply into those markets.
Oh, absolutely. So maybe that kind of leads on to thinking about your process as you evaluate those companies, the metrics that you look for. So apart from the therapeutic areas, what then makes you decide which of those programs, even though there's sparsity of them, but still, how do you pick the ones that you really take on?
In terms of our programs, we look at it the way any biopharma organization would look at it. Is the intervention, whatever it is, vaccine, drugs, whatever, is it ready for development? And even more so from a regulatory perspective, is it developable? Right? And so 95% of our staff is deeply biopharma experienced. So we look at these programs the way we would look at it as any biopharma organization would look at, and we make the decision as to whether or not it is, is it ready to be developed or not. So as I said, there are two aspects to it. Is it in an area of specific interest, right? Both to the foundation and to ourselves, all right? And is the intervention ready for development?
And so when do you start to foster relationships with potential partners, strategics, healthcare investors? I don't know whether you would even be able to kind of tell us some kind of case study or story about something that would help us to try to understand the timings and the transitions. And
so many of our programs actually flow through, not all, but many flow through, again, from work that the foundation has funded, either to academic investigators or even to biopharma companies, right? Sometimes large and sometimes small. And in many of those cases, particularly the biopharma companies, These are programs that the companies themselves started, and then they became involved with support from the foundation to continue to develop up to a certain point. Okay, and then again, they reach a point where the company is no longer willing to continue to directly invest, and therefore that effort. And it's not just financial investment, right? It's investment of your people's resources. Okay, which is fine. So it's perfectly understandable and perfectly acceptable at that point for those programs then to move to an organization like the Institute, right? Where our resources are entirely focused on those kinds of programs, right? And therefore we move them on. So if you take a look at the ones that right now we're focused on both a TB novel drug therapeutic program, we're focused on the TB novel vaccine program, several versions of that program. A malaria prophylactic program, a interesting maternal and neonatal and child health program, a Shigella vaccine program. We all looked at them very carefully, both with respect to interest, both with respect, as I said, to the developability of the specific interventions, and that's when we take them on.
Yeah, okay. And now COVID has had a huge impact, of course, globally on so many different aspects of life and everything else. And has COVID altered any of the priorities and processes at the Gates MRI?
It's not altered any of the priorities, because like any development programs, these are long-term development programs. There was a period of time in the middle it seems like it's been, decades, but it's only been 2 years. It's in the middle of the early years of the COVID pandemic, where the MRI conducted a few clinical studies related to potential interventions. But that actually is a really good example. I mean, there's an area where a lot of the work done for COVID, both for drugs, therapeutics, vaccines, the large biopharma companies, the small biopharma companies, right? They were all very heavily focused on this, right? And when you look at it, that's not an area for the Institute to be involved in, right? And that's an important consideration relative to just going beyond COVID for a second. If there's an intervention that clearly has a high income country, I'll just call it general commercial market of interest to a biopharma company, but could also be usable and very important for lower and middle income countries, right? Then under those circumstances, we typically will not be involved, right? Because under those circumstances, most of the biopharma companies that will obtain support either from the foundation, from the Wellcome Trust, from other similar organizations, and even from the kind of funds, Zena, that you described, to then continue the development of those products, not just for their commercial markets, but also for these other markets, right? Then they could potentially then sublicense those to those other markets. That's not our niche at the Institute, right? Because that work will still be done. It will still be done by the original biopharma company, right? It's a matter of it being funded by other sources to extend the market, if you will, to the lower middle income countries, but it'll still be done. Our niche is if that work never gets done, right? Or if it could never get done because it's an intervention, but for which there is no interesting commercial market, at least at the scale that typical biopharma company looks at. And that's when we'll pick up the risk to do the development work.
That's really interesting. Actually, you may have seen, we actually issued a press release earlier on this week about the work that we're doing. So we've just launched a global health fund aimed at, as I said earlier, sort of investing in innovation in high income markets and bridging and bringing those products to patients globally. So what we saw, and including middle income and low income countries. So our belief is that we're sort of essentially addressing a funding gap that exists, because investors nevertheless still are so focused on the high income markets and still are developing products and only getting regulatory approvals in high income markets. So for us to be able to enable and fund that work to bridge is kind of aligned with what you're doing in a slightly different way, because we still would encourage them to be in the high income markets too. So there's no need not to do that. But for us, we need to make sure that a plan is absolutely in place to make sure that those products get to low income and middle income.
It's a great concept, and one that, as obviously has been around also for a few years in sort of similar kinds of funds. No, and those are good sources of funding, and some have been quite successful, in fact. So, there have been good sources of funding in order to allow the expansion of the development work to go beyond I'll call it the primary commercial market of the primary developer. And that's critical to have that. And whether that money comes from funds such as yours, or whether it comes from the Gates Foundation, whether it comes from the Wellcome Trust, and there are others out there as well. It's as long as they get appropriately developed, for and made available to low and middle income country populations that need them, it's critical. But we're filling that gap where there is that commercial market is not there.
Right.
The high income country commercial market is not there, and someone needs to take on the development risk, right? And which is, as you know, is the primary driver for a lot of the decisions that are made for development is the risk, because even none of the programs that we're working on, just like any other development program, is guaranteed in the end to be successful. Right? So the work, the effort, the resources, the people, the financing of that risk is completely independent of is something which is funded at the moment by the foundation, and we then do the development work.
No, I think that's phenomenal. And I think, there are so many of us that are somehow bridging certain gaps and working on certain things to make sure, but I'm really appreciating all the work that you're doing to make sure that actually you're addressing the parts where there is no market in high income at all, but you're really focused on that, making sure that those products get to the markets that are not easy to fund programs for, which is incredible. I have a final question, because as we think about the program for this forum, there's a key spotlight that will be discussed later in the program, which highlights the risks and potential solutions to address antimicrobial resistance. So I'd love to hear how the Gates MRI is addressing this extensive issue of antimicrobial resistance.
No, antimicrobial resistance is a very significant issue, as you mentioned, and and actually an area of interest to organizations like the Gates Foundation, like the Wellcome Trust in particular, and others as well. We are not directly involved in the development of novel antimicrobial agents, with one exception, and that is in the area of tuberculosis, right, where we're looking at novel combinations of drugs. So any anti-infective agent, by definition, if you're working in that field, you are, to one extent or another, focused on the whole issue of antimicrobial resistance. So that's an important consideration. But we're also looking at different interventions, right? So, for instance, I mentioned malaria prophylactic program. The objective of the malaria prophylactic program is to develop a monoclonal antibody that will prevent malarial infection in young children, and avoid the use of chemoprophylaxis, right? Because one of the challenges with chemoprophylaxis is the potential of the development of antimicrobial resistance to the chemoprophylaxis. The hope is that with a biological intervention, for all sorts of scientific reasons, may not occur as easily, or may not even occur at all, and so that eliminates that potential issue. The other way, of course, to deal with antimicrobial resistance, Zena, is to develop a vaccine. Because if you got a good vaccine, if you prevent the infection in the first place, you don't have to worry about treating the infection, right? So that's always been. I've worked in the vaccine field for decades, and that was always one of our primary drivers, which is you're better off preventing the infection than you are having to treat the infection. So you take a look at something like, for instance, our enteric vaccine area that we're working in right now, which is Shigella and Shigella vaccine. Well, Shigella, as you know, is opposed to dysentery, and a significant issue in low-income countries. And shigellosis, dysentery can be treated, with antimicrobial agents. But the fear, of course, is extensive use of those agents will eventually lead to the loss of the effectiveness of those agents. So one way to avoid that from happening is, in fact, to prevent the infection in the first place, and hence the development of the vaccine.
Yep. No, I fully agree. I think you're doing amazing work. We are also appreciative of that. And, it's been an absolute pleasure to learn more about your and the Gates MRI's work. It's impressive. It's different. It bridges a huge unmet medical need and commercial and life need. Frankly, you're saving lives, and we're all grateful for that. So thank you very much for all your and the Gates MRI's efforts in delivering these healthcare solutions to address substantial global healthcare concerns in low and middle income countries. So And,
Well, Zina,
and thanks for your time.
Well, thank you very much, Zina. It was a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you.
Tackling neurological disorders has been an ongoing global effort. Thanks to major research programs like the Brain Initiative in the United States and others around the world, as well as advancements in molecular technologies and the genetic revolution, a new therapeutic age is coming in the treatment of neurological and brain disorders. But progress will rely on approaching these brain diseases strategically and collaboratively. Please welcome Walter Corachettes, Director, National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke, National Institutes of Health.
Welcome to the WuXi Health Forum, and this is the Neuro Challenge. And I'm going to talk to you about brain disorders and brain function. As you probably know, brain disorders are incredibly common. They rob people of their potential to grow, to interact with others, to contribute to society. So real tragedies, and they're very common. They occur during development of the brain due to injury, or as the population ages due to neurodegeneration. One can conceive of the brain as the most amazing computing system one could ever imagine. It does information processing to enable all our behaviors, our thoughts, our emotions. The computing power is based on 85 billion electrically firing neurons with trillions of connections between them in a complex supporting milieu. It's done by an organ that's just a couple of pounds, operating on such low energy, they were drawn to understand how it works. The Brain Initiative is a major research program in the US, and there are other programs going on around the world that have recently developed powerful new tools to understand how information processing does occur in the brain, to map, to monitor, and modulate brain circuits on a much grander scale than anyone could have imagined just a couple of years ago. And this has actually spurned a new field of what we call neuromorphic computing, trying to understand how to build better computers based on the lessons from brain science. Now, neurological disorders are those that I would characterize as that when you look under the microscope, you can see an injury pattern, a damaged circuit, sometimes localized to one area, like in a stroke or traumatic brain injury, sometimes regionalized to a couple of areas, such as Parkinson's disease or amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, and sometimes it spreads throughout the entire brain, such as Alzheimer's disease. I would say that the other disorders, which we call psychiatric disorders, are brain circuit disorders. We just can't see the abnormality under the microscope, but the circuit function is very disordered. All the major psychiatric disorders, bipolar illness, for example, where the circuits flip from one normal functioning state to a manic psychosis, then back to a deep depression, schizophrenia, major depression, opioid addiction. These are pure circuit disorders, but they are brain disorders, just as Parkinson's or ALS are disorders of the nervous system. Many brain disorders, such as autism, for instance, are due to errors in how the circuits are initially constructed during the development of the human. In truth, the biology that amazes me the most is how this complex circuit is put together by dividing cells who somehow figure out how to migrate to specific places and make connections to each other to enable human functions. And there are a number of things that can go wrong in this that lead to significant disability and mental development. And those occur throughout life. And the brain itself is not entirely hardwired because it does have plasticity. The strength of the connections between the nerve cells, they change based on the inputs that they are receiving. And in fact, that's how we learn. And at some point, I think the knowledge of brain circuits should inform how we educate children, because in fact, what we are doing in education is actually molding brain circuits to do calculus or to read Shakespeare. Now, if we think about brain sciences going back to the beginning of the modern era, we learned a lot about the molecules that are involved in information processing in the brain. Of the 14 Nobel Prizes in neuroscience, all but 2 are given for molecular discoveries. These include the channels that are in the membranes of nerve cells through which electrically charged particles can flow and make the neurons fire, and then receptors for chemical neurotransmitters that mediate the jump of transmission of activity from one neuron to another. And drugs that modulate those channels were discovered to treat seizures or pain, and drugs that modify the receptor function for these neurotransmitters have been very valuable, say, in Parkinson's disease or in depression. Molecular technology has progressed over the last 2 decades to a really new level. So for instance, now we can much more easily get the 3D molecular structure of these receptors, and one can develop computational approaches in silico to explore the entire chemical space for drugs to modulate these receptors. Thanks to the Brain Initiative tools, we have another really important ability now, and that is to test the effects of promising small molecules on circuit function, where we can record for millions of neurons simultaneously and then see what a drug does to the circuit, something we could really never do before. That was a black box. We had the biology of the drug and the receptor, and then we had to go into the human to see what the behavioral effects are. Those behavioral effects are due to a change in circuit function. Now we can actually look at that. But in this century, things began to move very fast due to the genetic revolution. We've been able to identify mutations that cause a small subset of people to develop very common diseases, say Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, autism, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, and also many rare diseases. The ability to find the gene that causes the trouble has allowed people to go and understand the pathways that are affected by these mutations to cause Alzheimer's or ALS, for instance. And what's really the next step is to try to learn from these mutations about the more common non-inherited forms of disease. And this is actually happening now in multiple different disorders. So for instance, in Alzheimer's disease, the initial discovery was due to mutations in the amyloid protein that cause Alzheimer's. Now we have anti-amyloid therapies that are being tested, not just in people who have that mutation, but in most people who have Alzheimer's disease. Similarly with Parkinson's disease, the initial discovery was a mutation in a protein called synuclein, only to find that everyone with Parkinson's disease has aggregates of synuclein, whether they have the mutation or not. The new era now opens the ability to develop small molecules and even targeted antibody therapies to intervene in these pathologic pathways that have been opened up by the study of the genetic abnormalities. And also the development of radioligands that bind to drug targets that can, say, now be visualized on PET scans. So now in the discovery of treatments for Alzheimer's disease, patients have PET scans to see if they have amyloid or they have tau. And that has made a huge difference in choosing patients for particular therapies. These are a sense of biomarkers. So these would be, say, diagnostic biomarkers, but we also have biomarkers of target engagement, things that you would make your drug to interact with a particular biomarker with the idea that if it does so, you have a good chance of seeing effect when you go into humans. So those are biomarkers of target engagement, really important as we move towards therapies now, because years ago, the problem was we didn't have a lot of targets. The problem now is we have lots of targets. We have to pick and choose very carefully for those who are going to have the greatest effect sizes. In addition, some of these biomarkers will allow us to identify people who are going to develop diseases such as Alzheimer's or Parkinson's decades before they actually have any disabling symptoms. That offers a tremendous ability to step in and try and treat people before any symptoms show up, and maybe even stop the disease from ever showing itself. And that's really a definition of a cure. These molecular interventions have had real impact in the lives of patients. but cures in the nervous system are still few and far between for their disorders. My opinion, this is just my opinion now, is that our small molecule drugs have a problem. They're not sufficiently precise, and they affect too many parts of a circuit when we're trying to make a change in the nervous system and trying to target one feature. We tend to run into problems where we don't get the effect we need because the doses we need to get that effect are causing trouble throughout the nervous system. So epilepsy is a good example. Drugs that depress the overexuberant firing in seizures also affect normal firing. So there's a dose that you can't go above because it will affect the normal functioning of the human. And so you don't actually ever get control of some people's seizures. Actually, about 30% of people have seizures that the drugs currently available don't touch. But these, I think there's an answer coming from the explosion in genomic therapy that will get us past this ceiling effect that I think we're running into now. And that's because the modern neuroscience allows us to get inside single neural cells to understand what is the problem that's related to the disease. And we can do this now at scale. With the new technologies, we can look inside millions of single neural cells, identify the cell type, identify what are the pathological features in the cells that are sick, what are the features in the cells that are not quite sick yet, but are going to get sick. Incredibly powerful technologies now from the single cell abilities. And one can do this in human brain as well as in animal tissue. And now what's happening in neuroscience is that people can use these techniques to understand the pathways that are going on inside the cells and then use genomic techniques to precisely alter those. So one has now technologies where you can go into the cell and you can shut off a causative pathologic component, or you can overexpress a compensatory molecular mechanism to improve the health of that cell. And this can be done in human neurons that have been taken initially from the skin biopsy, and then they are developed with iPSC technologies into human neurons. So one can actually do these experiments now in human neurons taken from patients with a disease or normal individuals. Really powerful techniques that we didn't have before, but we were really forced to work only in the animal space. So I'm optimistic that the future development to means to modulate gene expression, to suppress damaging pathways, to upregulate compensatory pathways, and to do this in a very precise way with very potent interventions at the target will allow us to see results that we've never been able to achieve in the past in terms of health, promoting health in the nervous system and treating neurological diseases. The success in treating spinal muscular atrophy is an example. It's a disease that's fatal in the first year of life in infants due to motor neuron death and paralysis of the infant. But antisense oligonucleotides that change the splicing of an alternative gene showed great benefit, and gene replacement showed even better benefit. So here's a disease where these genomic techniques, children who would be dead after a year are now many years out and walking and doing well. So you'll hear this story repeated, and you'll hear about it in the discussions coming up with regard to Parkinson's disease as part of this forum. But there are many examples of serious neurological disorders that are on the cusp of seeing new therapeutic trials. Success is a feature not only of the rigorous science, but also the persistence of industry, the persistence of the scientists, and particularly the persistence of patients in volunteering for these potentially high benefit trials. So the patients deserve it. A new therapeutic age is coming to brain disorders, both neurologic and psychiatric disorders. But I think unless we approach these brain diseases strategically, progress will be way too slow. If we're not careful, there will be adverse events that could set progress back. So together, globally, we need to address this problem in a really clever fashion. And I think that we can make a tremendous difference in the short term, and this is something that the patients really deserve. So thanks very much for your attention.
According to the World Health Organization, of the 17 million premature deaths under the age of 70 due to non-communicable diseases in 2019, 38% were caused by cardiovascular diseases. Yet we know that cardiovascular diseases are predictable, manageable, reversible, and preventable. What are the key challenges getting in the way of innovation? Can we learn from other diseases like oncology? What are the right things to do for patients? Please welcome Mariel Jessup, Chief Science and Medical Officer, American Heart Association, and Fayez Zanad, Emeritus Professor of Therapeutics and Cardiology, Université de Lorraine, INSERM and Chairman, CVCT, Paris, France.
Mariel, and we are from both sides of the Atlantic, and you have been extremely active in the worldwide cardiology, and certainly from the United States. But the interest of our discussion today that we may be having looks from both sides of the Atlantic. We have been over wonderful progresses in many areas, and certainly in one of the areas we share is the heart failure, but many other areas. But I'm sure there are frustration and where we'd like things to move on, and so to say, if we have a chance to have a call for action, what would be your priority call for action?
Well, thank you, and yes, we have. We've been privileged, you and I, to watch great progress in a variety of cardiovascular diseases. But I'm going to steal the call to action that we have at the American Heart Association, and that is what we call our 2024 impact goal, which is the 100th year anniversary of the American Heart Association. And what we say is that every person deserves the opportunity for a full and healthy life. And that has so many parts to making that happen. It means that we have to have better discovery. We have to have empowering our scientists to find new approaches to disease. It means that we have to solve the problem of access to good care. It means we have to solve the problem of implementing great care that's available. You and I've talked in the past about how do we get clinicians to do the right thing, which are outlined in the guidelines, but people don't follow them. And it's also really trying to understand that there's so much of cardiovascular disease and stroke that can be prevented. So when we say every person deserves the opportunity for a full and healthy life, that means we have to hit all of those areas. And so that's what I do think about a lot in my role, and how to implement that in all the different domains. How about you? What do you worry about?
You're right, and actually you are hitting on two very important topics. One is the implementation of what we have as evidence already, and certainly in improving healthy aging. And for example, we really know how to lower blood pressure, but still so many people are uncontrolled. We have uncontrolled blood pressure. So implementation science and improving the implementation policy of having blood pressure under control, just simple. And we have the evidence, right? But of course, on the other side is growing with new evidence for new strategy of primary and primordial prevention. And certainly this is very important in our respective countries, but worldwide, I mean, globally, the cardiovascular prevention is kind of forgotten. There is lots of intensive work in treating the diseases, alleviating symptoms, and progresses with new medication every year. But the main challenge of prevention is, of course, running trials, because these trials will be 10,000 patients over 10 years follow-up if we have to be stuck with the morbidity, mortality endpoints. So we need to be creative in order to get these primordial or primary prevention trials, and likely, rely on some sort of surrogacy, right? With blood pressure and cholesterol was very easy because these are two very strong surrogates, right? But in healthy aging, we need to rely on other surrogates. And I would really advocate a call for action for more work on validating surrogates. These may be intensive multi-omic universal surrogates, for example, or any other sorts of surrogates. And we need to have more intense work onto this in order to prepare for evidence-based primary and primordial prevention. Do you think so?
Well, absolutely. I think, however, that all of the promises that we hear about so often, for instance, technology and personal devices, and all of us work daily with electronic medical records, but we haven't figured out a way to harness that all. So that too often technology, first of all, not everyone can afford the technology that's out there, like the special watches or all kinds of fancy blood pressure monitoring devices. And they aren't integrated into an electronic medical record so that they're sort of standalone, capturing information that may be getting to an individual person, but not necessarily to that person's providers or clinicians. And then, at least in the United States, we spent billions of dollars developing electronic medical records, but there's still great barriers to capitalizing on the rich information that's there. But as we've been working to think about solutions and research funding into these solutions, I personally am very convinced that we need to come together as countries and say, what can we do? Just as you say, yes, we need clinical trials, but we need to be able, because we want to have a diverse enrollment, and we want to have sort of a longitudinal enrollment. Not any single company can pay for that, and not even any single country can pay for that. But by doing very simple trials and engaging the community to tackle these individual problems, and perhaps tackling them with the added information that we can get from these personal devices, I think that's the promise in the future, so that we have a community of people wearing a blood pressure monitor, that they may agree that it will all come together on a single platform, and that different countries will agree on some specific issues that we need to address. That's what I'd love to see happen in the future. We're doing baby steps around that. I know that would excite you because you're instrumental in thinking about trials to answer questions.
Yeah, well, going pragmatic and providing, promoting simple trials is certainly high in the agenda, and we are making progress, but much slower than in the oncology field, for example. And you are really right into highlighting the importance of, electronic health records, and which would make, trials much easier. And certainly we are making progress, certainly in Europe, and we have this example of the Sweetheart and the many randomized registry trials, which has done wonderful progress in this field. And the other unmet need, and for me, is that trials are conducted mainly in Western world, and a whole part of the world in Asia, in Africa, and Middle East are not part of the trials, and not part of the evidence generation effort, the global efforts. And how to make this diversity happen, it's going to be challenging, especially if we go digital, because in these countries, they are going to be experiencing the same issues, and maybe more than the issues you and me are having in our respective countries. So I wonder, what is your experience into with diversity within trials, with ethnic diversity of representation of more women, with mainly underrepresented trials, but also geographical diversity. What is your experience, and what would you recommend how to overcome these issues?
Well, I think the good news, I'll tell you what we're doing at the American Heart Association, because I'm very proud that we've really, made an effort to do this. But I also want to say that the American Heart Association is part of a global cardiovascular funders, and they've just agreed that we're going to work together. Cardiovascular funders all over the world are going to work together around health equity and tackle one of these issues, which is what I think has to happen. I also think that we have to engage our industry partners to help us with this, and we need to all work together around a common goal. We at the American Heart Association have a funding model called Strategically Focused Research Network, and it's 4 or 5 centers that come together to form a network around a specific topic. And we're about to finish the second round of peer review for a strategically focused research network on the science of diverse enrollment in clinical trials. So we've challenged investigators to bring their ideas about really sort of demonstration projects about how to make sure that we're getting diverse enrollment. How do we engage communities so that there's community-based participatory research? How do we partner with other organizations besides hospitals or medical centers? So I'm very excited about the science that will come out of this. I think it's important to call it science and publish the results and say, this is the first set of scientifically proven ways to ensure diverse enrollment. Interestingly, we do have some partners in this. So it's not just American Heart Association paying for that. We have a foundation that's committed to adding their dollars, as well as an industry partner. So I without bursting with pride, I will say that's a model that I think is very important as we go forward. So public-private collaboration around a multi-center network that will commit to working on the science of different projects.
Yeah, you must be congratulated for this. This is really very important. But there is the hypothesis out there as well that you may increase diverse patient population and participating in trials if you increase diversity among trial leadership, right? So you are a great example, and we have been with the CVCT initiative initiating this future trialist in training, embedding young trialists from diversity into major trial steering committees and let them learn the job. So it is still a hypothesis that diverse trial leadership will improve diversity of patient participation, but it is very reasonable hypothesis. So anything in that sense you are doing from the American Heart or other places in promoting trial leadership, diversity in trial leadership?
Well, I think that's great, and the work you're doing is just so important. Every one of our funding models that involves multi-centers always has a training component. So there's a training component in this SFRN around the science of diverse enrollment, and in all of our other health equity research networks as well. We have always been concerned about training the next generation. Which reminds me about something else that's really important, and that is the scientists of old no longer sit in their own office and work in their own labs and write their own notes. And we have to really understand what the future of scientific discovery will look like, and we have to give the tools to these scientists to work together, whether they're in Africa or England or the United States, they need to be able to not just talk by Zoom like we are and like the world has done for the last 2 years, but they need to have secure, cloud-based, high-speed computing power so that they can work together in a workspace and analyze the data and catalyze the thinking of one another. That is one of the powers of a research network like Leduc Foundation has been doing for years. And it's bringing together senior and junior investigators into an environment where their ideas just explode, but we need to give them the tools to work together around their data as well. And I think that's something that industry has discovered faster than we have in academic medicine, maybe, that they're bringing together their scientists in a more opportune way and finding ways for them to work together. And we have to learn from that, I think.
Yeah, well, that's a great example you are taken here. But one other challenge is very important is how much we are learning from oncologists. Over the last 10 years, there have been tens of new oncology drugs approved, while there was only a handful of cardiovascular drugs. So what is your own take on this? And of course, there are many other lessons we can learn from oncologists, and certainly they're very straightforward, biomarker-based, more reliance on surrogates, etc. Are we making things too complicated in cardiovascular? I don't think personally. I still think that the evidence we are generating, which life-saving medication is essential, or shall we make it easier for cardiovascular using maybe conditional approval or other stuff in order to tease back investors into cardiovascular, because we are facing an issue.
It's so true. You know, as you well know, 1 in 3 people all over the world will die from cardiovascular disease. Every single person's lives are touched by cardiovascular disease. And so I think you're right. We have to make it easier, and we have to target diseases that are common. And we have to come up with novel ways of solving the problem. So for instance, we all know that there are great therapies to treat aortic stenosis, for example. But the fact of the matter is, no matter where you go in the world, people with aortic stenosis are under-recognized, under-treated, not followed carefully. And so if we can get industry to articulate the problem they're trying to solve with their therapy or with their drug, I think we can partner with them and solve it. And it may be that we can tackle little parts of the problem at a time. So it may not be just a trial to test the efficacy of a drug. It may be a trial to say, what system change can we make that will detect more patients with aortic stenosis, as an example. And so I think we have to take the big problem of cardiovascular disease and stroke and break it down into parts that we can likewise try to test for in clinical trials. We've been so dependent on industry and governments funding us that we perhaps maybe have stopped coming up with our own ideas and our own observations about what kinds of things need to be changed. And so I would hope we can do more of that we can come together to sort of look at a high level and say, we have to do better at hypertension, but we have to find those people. We have to monitor them long term. We have to do better at getting people to stop smoking. All the mainstays, we have to figure out a way to add your expertise to solving the problems. And I think the more we come together across the world, we'll be even more powerful. So that's being somewhat optimistic. It's a lot of work, and there are people that are going to have to come behind me to finish that up, because I don't think I'll be able to do that in my lifetime. But we should aim for that. We should outline the blue sky, as we say.
Yeah, well, persistence is very important, and you are right on to pinpointing this, but creativity is also important. And I know that everybody taken the example of the pandemic and how creative we have been into doing simple, cheap, fast trials. But still, this is the COVID trials where the event rate is very high and patients were available for enrollment much easier than cardiovascular. So I would like to dampen the enthusiasm of people taking the example of COVID, say, hey, they have done it. Why we cannot do it in the cardiovascular? It's not so simple. And we need really to highlight the driving process behind making cardiovascular trials so expensive and complex.
I think we have to learn more about how Sweden's doing it. Japan has been doing a big clinical trial program and has been very successful. And so I think we have to celebrate and learn from the successes that are out there, and be willing to speak out from whatever platforms we have to assure our industry partners that we can do things without spending too much money. And we have to find lots of ways to encourage a partnership with people that want to bring both devices and pharma to help our patients, because the need is so great.
Yeah, you are mentioning devices, and it's wonderful the type of progress we have done with devices in cardiovascular, and the innovative space is being extremely fertile in this space, maybe more than in the drug space, by the way, but also because the regulators are making it simpler for devices with this expedited access pathway, the 21st Century Act in the United States. Unfortunately, we're going backward in the other direction in Europe. In Europe, the device industry will not find it easy to develop their trials. And I'm here really calling for action from this side of the Atlantic, that we get to harmonize the needs and the effort and the development landscape with the United States and with the FDA. This is really very important, because we need this, collaboration in order to make progress faster and this innovation come to market faster.
If we could do one thing particularly well, and there are ways to actually even look this, the Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation in University of Washington can actually show what would happen if we took the world and, for instance, abolished smoking, what that would look like. And there is discernible, meaningful impact. So if the world could come together and say, we will no longer allow cigarettes, in 10 years, we could see a meaningful impact, and not only just on cardiovascular disease and stroke, but on cancer as well. So it's interesting to look at that statement and say, well, why aren't we doing that? What are the barriers that are standing in the way of countries all over the world coming together and saying, we're going to stop this? And I think that's where we leave science and get into the world, economics and politics and advocacy. So I may stop there and see what Fayez's predictions will be for 10 years.
If we do things right, and we know that cardiovascular diseases are predictable, they are manageable, and they are reversible, preventable. We know that, right? So if we do everything right, we can really fix the majority of cardiovascular diseases. And we do have an example, by the way, in Finland and in some other countries, when they've been after primordial prevention with a massive effort on lifestyle, on food, smoking, etc. It started in the 70s, 80s. And the dramatic change in the landscape of cardiovascular diseases, which plunged literally in terms of epidemiology. So we know that we can achieve that, but can we do things right worldwide? We can certainly try on a country basis, on a state basis, whatever. But if we go, worldwide, we will have many other challenges, and most of them, in my opinion, are dominated by two main challenges: the inequity within the worldwide, the income inequity, and the poverty in the world, and of course the climate change and the pollution. We tend to forget that pollution is among the very first risk factor, cardiovascular, also cancer, by the way, and cardiovascular. So if we can do things right, like we are learning from specific countries when it comes to lifestyle, etc., if we can do everything right into controlling climate change and pollution, then I'm sure we will reverse the trend, and cardiovascular may not be number one killer anymore.
Well, there's a lot to do, but I think that we can make progress because there's great innovation out there. So it's so nice to have talked to you.
Thank you so much, Marielle. It has been a delight. Thank you so much.
Cancer is a leading cause of death worldwide, accounting for nearly 10 million deaths in 2020, or nearly 1 in 6 deaths according to the World Health Organization. What can we do to bring high-quality cancer care to patients globally? Where is cancer treatment and care going in the next 5 to 10 years? Please welcome Harold Burstein, Institute Physician, Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, and Professor of Medicine, Harvard Medical School, Arif Kamal, Chief Patient Officer, American Cancer Society, and Physician Quality and Outcomes Officer, Duke Cancer Institute, and Tony Mok, Li Shufan Professor of Clinical Oncology, the Chinese University of Hong Kong.
Well, it's great to see everybody. Tony, do you want to start?
Sure. Now, speaking of, what the patient most desperate needs. Now, of course, we're talking about cure, but the question is that how do we define cure this day? I mean, in a sense, the old way of thinking of cure is that you get a disease, the disease come back anymore. But these days, I think we're taking the attitude is that we are going to achieve long-term survival for the patient. Like the ALK positive lung cancer patient, now we expect them the 5-year survival rate at stage 4 to be 62%. Now, this was not something that we could have done 10 years ago, but now we can have the confidence of saying that. So I think that this will not change in a way of the patient desperately want to survive and also survive with a high quality of living in a way of that the toxicity has to be minimized. So I think that is a challenge where to provide the patient. In other words, if we are likely going to transform cancer into a chronic illness in order to be able to give the patient longer survival without toxicity.
Yeah, I think patients are desperate for that. The well-informed patient nowadays knows that there are many different kinds of cancer. They know there'll be a lot of testing to define their tumor. And what they're hoping to identify is that, miracle drug, that, imatinib for CML, the ALK inhibitors for ALK-associated lung cancer, the trastuzumab for HER2-positive breast cancer. They really want to identify these very selective, very powerful drugs. And the hope is that we're going to have more and more options along those lines to truly transform these cancer experiences. We were giving platinum doublets for 30 years, and that's what we had until we had some of these newer options. So they were able to quickly establish, all things considered, these immune checkpoint inhibitors in many of these situations. I think the next wave of that is really promising, but will be a lot harder because we've already raised the standards with the first round, and now it's going to be very challenging to figure out which tumors to select for ongoing immunotherapy or adoptive T cells or whatever it's going to be in that space. And I think in that particular area, the fruit will be ripe, but it's going to take longer to ripen than it has in this first iteration here. So that's something that we clearly desperately need, though.
Yeah, I sort of desperately worry for patients for whom we are innovating, but their ability to access that innovation is quite limited. What we don't want to get to is a future state where we are having amazing outcomes, but only for a certain part of the population, and not because of their receptor status, not because of their pathology, but because of their ability to access treatment.
And think blue sky, as they say, big picture. We're rising to the challenge of thinking ahead about cancer. Give me some quick takes on where you think we should be going over the next 5 or 10 years in thinking about cancer treatment and science and collaboration with patients.
Right. I think this is a so-called a real blue sky question, and there's so many directions we can go. But I can kind of share with you what excites me the most. That's what we have on hand, and then some that may excite us in the future. So what I see is the fact that I think ADC is on the rise right now. I mean, there's no doubt that there are data that drug being approved, and I think this is a direction that we have started many years ago. I think it's actually going to get into clinic in a major way in the near future. And then in terms of cell therapy, there is also the excitement that, you know, it is actually a landmark already in hematology, but how does it migrate into the solid tumor? But however, I think the key thing is that how can make it affordable of the cellular therapy to the general population with the solid tumor. So I think those are the two huge areas that actually may impact on our clinical practice in the near future. But I think to think far ahead, I think there are a number of areas, including the application of AI in the clinic already in place. But I think the potential of making AI into our day-to-day practice is actually going to be in our future as well.
So I think you're right about the AI. You know, one of the things I've been struck by is some early work in pathology and radiology in particular, where you know, you can get augmented readings of CAT scans or mammograms by the artificial intelligence machine learning networks. And the same, I think, is going to be true in pathology. So it's easy to imagine in the future that, you know, a cancer specimen will have a routine pathology read by a pathologist and then a backup or secondary read by the artificial intelligence module, and the same true for radiology. And one of the things I think is very exciting about that, aside from the improved quality and maybe even some re-diagnosis, is the accessibility, because all of a sudden you can have digital imaging beamed anywhere in the world and even have very high quality interpretation of those pathology or radiology images almost anywhere that you have an internet link with high-speed access and the equipment and software. So that really has the potential to broaden, I think, you know, world-class care to huge corners of the globe.
Well, taking that one step further, I think AI may do something that pathologists may not be able to do. We just recently published together with a Korean group on application AI to look at tumor-infiltrated lymphocytes. I mean, to count those lymphocytes in reference to their position to the cancer is a meticulous work. It would be almost impossible for human to do that. So I think that's one actually potential direction, is to do a very difficult task that actually human may not be able to do on a day-to-day basis.
Right. And imagine if we keep pulling on that thread and we start taking AI information and doing clinical trials matching too. For example, off of pathology and radiology data, you can start sorting through really quick eligibility, sorting and sifting to get to a place where we're actually in real time potentially even recommending particular clinical trials or clinical studies or clinical correlate designs and things like that. And that sort of getting to speed and efficiency from, you know, biopsy to actually clinical study or trial is a great vision to think about too.
we had a presentation by one of my colleagues who's very interested in geriatric oncology, and they were developing a new instrument. There have been lots of these instruments, but a new instrument to look at geriatric oncology and the predictors of less favorable outcome, functionality, age, comorbid health conditions, previous hospitalization. And they want us to fill out the form. And I raised my hand and I said, all that's in the electronic health record. Can't we do something to abstract that information from the health record and have a little flag pop up and say, hey, this person's at some risk for vulnerability? So small and big applications there, really waiting to be tapped into, I think.
Yeah, and imagine remote sensors and remote patient monitoring. I mean, what we want, we recognize in cancer care, right, that patients spend 99% of their time not in our cancer centers, right? Not within our cancer hospitals. And so having, real-time data feeds and collection of data from, movement and performance status and symptomatology and other things, we can start to, for example, use things like augmented reality, actually do a geriatric assessment at home. So actually patients come to clinic with that data already collected in place.
Now, switching topic a little bit from AI, I actually want to raise the point. I think this is a point that we spoke a lot in ASCO, Harold. It's the fact that about globalization of oncology care. I mean, in a way, is that we are blessed in the better developed country of the high quality cancer care, but I mean, around the world is still very underdeveloped. How do we embrace this challenge of bringing the so-called the high quality cancer care to the world? I mean, in a global scale. What's your take? In the our role, and then the the role of actually better developed country in contribution to the cancer care of the less developed country.
Well, there are several big challenges. So, one of them is that the new treatments are very expensive. You began the session by talking about antibody drug conjugates and immune therapies and adoptive T cell transfers and other CAR T kind of visions for the future. And those are on the order of costs of hundreds of thousands of dollars for a year of therapy. So one important thing is going to be to develop competing products that will eventually change the financial landscape of the care itself. That's no small thing because at the moment, for instance, many of the competing checkpoint inhibitors or other novel targeted drugs are priced very uniformly. There's very little actual market competition for pricing of those items at the moment. And so that sort of strategy needs to be reconsidered if we're going to really make these drugs available to much of the rest of the world. I think the second big thing is really care models, and I'm going to be interested in Arif's position on this because I know he has actually thought a lot about integrating various care models into oncology care. But the care in a cancer center is only part of the experience of a cancer patient, and all the other pieces that go into their care, whether it's symptom control and management, integration with surgery and radiation oncology, coordination with primary care, things that really can impact favorably, if they're available, the experience of a cancer patient. Those are very labor and time expensive investments, and many healthcare systems just simply don't have the resources, even if they have access to the drugs, don't have the resources to provide that kind of extensive care.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. And I was just going to say on the drug side of things, I think as we think about value-based cancer care delivery in general, that it's important to realize that all the parts of the ecosystem, to really truly meet that goal, need to think in a value-based way too. And so just as oncologists and health systems are thought about as aligning sort of the resource use to an outcome, it's important to think about a potential future where we really think about that from an intervention perspective as well, pharma and other interventions too. So for example, and this is an important question just for all of us to think about and ask, is if a drug has a particular benefit in a phase 3 multi-site trial, but then in post-marketing has a different outcome, better, worse, or the same, we have to ask ourselves, that would be like saying an oncologist who promises something particular, a health system promises something particular, and then the real thing is actually different. So the question is could there be a future where there's actually value-based contracts related to the intervention itself, where actually there's modifications made? That's a policy decision that's above, honestly, any of our pay grades. But it is a conversation that is starting to happen because every other component, the oncology delivery part, the hospital-based clinic infusion delivery part, the hospitalization part of healthcare. So the drug part will eventually come into play too. And it's an important conversation to say, are we ready? Is anyone ready to make a modification, for example, to a payment for the intervention because the outcome is different, better, worse, or the same than what we might have expected from the trial itself? Important question to answer.
I agree with both of you. And I look at the problem slightly from a different angle. Instead of asking the question how, let's first ask the question who. I mean, right now, it is mostly the academic organization like ESCO, ESMO, who talk about this problem. WHO also talk about the globalization because it's part of their responsibility. But in a way, is that we are not the so-called the organization with the financial ability. So the question is that should the pharmaceutical industry join us into this effort of globalization? If so, how best to do it? I mean, in a sense, is a lot of pharma will actually contribute some to the developing world, but I think only a fraction. I'm not asking much. I just ask that if they can at least put the topic of globalization, cancer care into their board agenda, at least they talk about it, think about it, and contribute as a group together with the academic organization to look at this effort. I think that would be the first step to face this challenge, in my humble opinion.
Mm-hmm. It's an interesting idea. Pharmaceutical companies are often already very global. Many of them have presence on every continent. It's a very fine line to walk between having them deeply engaged in healthcare systems and having them not too engaged in healthcare systems for obvious reasons. But certainly the global demand of cancer is going to outpace heart disease in the next 10 or 20 years as the #1 cause of mortality in the world. And that's going to be true both in the developed countries, but also in traditionally low and middle income countries as they become more affluent and have less fatality from traditional diseases of both poverty and infectious disease and more from sort of diseases of society, heart disease and cancer. And so figuring out systems to really care for both the number of people and the economic scale that's appropriate is going to be a big challenge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The other thing I think about is just the cognitive burden and workload. We talked about AI, but really there's decision making assistance that's really needed here. I'd sort of just roughly kind of counted the number of FDA approvals and black box warnings and indication changes just in the last decade, just to sort of answer the question for myself. And the number, I think I stopped counting around 300. The point being, and most of them, as we know, are really applied to our field, right? To medical oncology in some way. And I think a lot about sort of the cognitive burden of being able to keep up with that, particularly as a general medical oncologist, if there are many of those left. But for those of us who are trying to think broadly, and it's tough out there. And what we have to think about as we're innovating and thinking about, precision medicine and particular diagnostics and matching patients to the right treatment is how do we keep our workforce sort of in the know and up to speed with the rapid changing science in a way where it's not just the oncologists that are going to the national or the international meetings that are kept up to speed, because we want the diffusion of innovation in oncology, I think, to be much better than sort of the native medicine diffusion of innovation, which I think is around 17 years, right? People in oncology can't wait 17 years for us to be up to speed with various things. And so how we close that gap from, groundbreaking thing into pathways or guidelines and then into actual practice, we have to think a lot about closing that gap, and we'll need good ideas about how to do that.
Well, this day I learned from Twitter rather from conferences.
It's true. It's where everything is exciting is happening. So Tony, I was interested when you opened with ADCs and immunotherapy, you jumped right past the stuff that made your career, which was genomic testing and the molecular subsets of lung cancer. So is that a dead field already? Have we moved quickly beyond that kind of genomic sequencing?
No, that definitely not. I avoid saying it so that the focus would not be on my kind of work. So yes, I think that molecular testing will continue to boom. Now that we kind of had taken the low-hanging fruit like EGFR, and also that is actually mostly still in lung cancer. But I'm sure that there are other that's kind of coming up, but then the so-called incidence of those mutations may be lower. So genomic testing is going to be around. And more so, I think it is the fact that we are going to have our so-called another layer of the resistance mechanism, which we are start to learn and how to so-called personalize the management of the resistance. So that direction, I think, is probably still to go take us to the next level of the molecular testing. But I think at the end of the day, we still have to make the molecular testing to be so-called affordable, such that the wider population can benefit from it. Because in a sense, it's from my area of the world, in Asia Pacific area, the so-called the number of patients who are accessible to NGS is still relatively low. So I think that is one direction that we should have to develop as well.
Yeah, I think it's pretty easy to imagine that in the by the end of the decade, almost every tumor, for state-of-the-art care will need genomic sequencing. We will find enough rare mutations. We will redefine, for instance, as we have with lung cancer, multiple subsets based on molecular sequencing. In breast cancer, the majority of tumors are ER positive, and for them, we're looking at genomic assays to decide whether or not to give chemotherapy as well. And I think we're going to actually be doing a lot of genetic testing as well. Again, in breast and ovarian cancer, and prostate cancer, and pancreatic cancer, we now have activity for drugs that are particularly useful in patients with hereditary cancer syndromes. And it's easy to imagine similar stories emerging in other tumors down the road. So it's going to be a very different world and speak to some of those needs for artificial intelligence when you suddenly have complete genomic sequencing of the tumor, complete genetic sequencing of the patient. But that's going to be pretty standard, I think, for cancer patients diagnosed in the next few years, certainly in the US. And then figuring out how to use all that information will be exciting. But that's going to be a real sea change in how we think about what kind of cancer it is and who the patient is.
Yeah. Right now, I think we're still very limited by the turnaround time for the whole exome sequencing, to make it clinically applicable. But I do see that there are already technology going to help us to cut short this so-called the turnaround time from the tissue to the DNA analysis to the subsequently the bioinformatics. I think that hopefully is going to be make it as so-called applicable in the clinic.
Yeah, I agree. And we're going to have to continue to pay attention to access to those testing guidelines that demonstrate and emphasize the testing being needed. Because as we're seeing, you brought up EGFR, I mean, we're still seeing patients with lung cancer, right, who are just not being tested. And that is not necessarily at academic medical centers, but a lot of interest from pharma and other places about doing quality improvement projects, honestly, in areas that I didn't know that we still need to do quality improvement projects. But the reality is that because of delays in testing or forgetting testing or even processes where it's unclear who's going to order the test, which is always interesting to see, right? In any sort of multidisciplinary setting, particularly where the biopsy is kind of where it's starting, then actually it's not whether the medical oncologist knows that the testing needs to happen, but it's actually others involved in the process too, in terms of tissue acquisition or rebiopsy or whatever is needed. So exactly, getting a core, is that in fact what we need instead of FNA? So those things is also paying really close attention to how our guidelines and those best practices for that actually get to medical oncology, but then beyond medical oncology to any person who's really accessing tissue, so that all the best practices are known. And so we're not having to go, oh, shoot, we forgot to get that. Do we have to get another biopsy scan? Do we have to do something different? And I think that's part of our, our responsibilities as the innovation is coming up. We think about the diffusion of that and the implementation of it, of course, all the people in the healthcare ecosystem. And it could be in international places too, that it may not be the medical oncologist at all. In fact, it may be a primary care physician or someone else who's sort of really shepherding a lot of that, sort of basic diagnostic work.
Arif, you bring up a very important point that actually apply to all of us who practice in clinic. That is the question of what is next for the patient. I mean, the patient will get used to having effective treatment. I mean, you get VEGF-R, you got improvement, and then you got resistant, you got another target therapy. But eventually, after you have a very good relationship with the patient always look up to you to say, what is next? Mm-hmm. But then when you get towards the end, that is always resort to clinical trial. Yeah. And especially the experimental drug in phase 1. Now, but that is actually very limited in access to a portion of patients in the United States, maybe in Europe. However, to having the experimental drug being available for a patient who may benefit from it. Just recently, I got a patient with KRAS G12D. They looked up and said, hey, this is a drug called KRAS inhibitor. But I thought you got a G12D, but not G12C. Yeah. But they also know that there is a clinical trial going on in G12D. But it's almost impossible to send the patient to United States for the consideration. So I just don't know. I mean, in a way, is that how can we get access to experimental drug earlier? Do you have any idea, to go into this direction challenges. I mean, in a way that do we really have to stay on the current scheme? Is that very tight control of the phase 1, in terms of their so-called very restricted environment before we can get access to this drug?
That's a great question. Historically, those restrictions on phase 1, first in human early drug development has been because of the argument that it's so mysterious what could happen, or you really need, experienced investigators to assess toxicity, and every single case matters a lot when you're doing a 3+3 traditional dosing escalation. But I think that one of the things I've seen over the past decade is that there are plenty of centers around the world that now have that expertise. And obviously the major centers in Europe, the United States, Canada, Australia, Japan, China, other places in Southeast Asia in particular, several in the Middle East, are going to have that kind of experience. That's where actually we could really use some help from pharma. Wouldn't it be amazing if they could begin to train some junior investigators at perhaps centralized facilities, but then to go back to their own communities, to be in their hospitals, and really be capable of bringing early drug discovery closer to the front lines of cancer care around the world, instead of a relatively isolated number of larger cancer centers, frequently in the US. That would be an extraordinary contribution, and I think it might fast forward a lot of drug discovery. The other thing is that the rewards of drug discovery have become so vast relative to the cost of doing clinical trials that it's easy to imagine multiple parallel sets of phase 1 early drug discovery trials going on at the same time. The idea that you're going to put all your eggs in one basket of a single phase 1 study doesn't really make sense anymore. And more what we're seeing in clinical trial design is quick movements to find a dose, and then rapid dissemination into phase 2 buckets. And there was a recent FDA call for sort of changing the design of clinical trials so that phase 1 and phase 2 are really built in much more seamlessly into the development schemes. I think that could really fast forward a lot of drug discovery, and is an example of where constructively we can work with pharma to train investigators and to decentralize some of that work.
Yeah, nowadays we see all the drug the same way, and we use the same formula to do our phase 1. But I mean, with the past experience, we know that certain class of drug are really not as toxic as the old drug that we are used to. So I think that we probably rethink, how best we perform our phase 1 trial, make it more efficient, make it more accessible, and make it less restrictive. I think that will facilitate the whole process and possibly cut down the cost eventually for the whole drug development process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think going along with that, we just need to demystify this. The training I had during fellowship, right? The classical training was that the chance of benefit for a patient participating in phase 1 trial is in the single-digit percentages. But I think even the ongoing positive results from the early phase 1 trials for checkpoint inhibitors in melanoma, for example, demonstrate that the number is way higher than that. And I think we can confidently say that we're in an era now where it's higher than in the single-digit percentages. And I think the mysticism that that this is super dangerous and not something we can prepare for or train people for or work our way through while keeping patients safe I think that's old thinking, frankly. And I think right now we have to sort of think about how we message phase 1 trials, how we train people to do it. And really even think about where, for example, supportive care and palliative care groups can be helpful and complementary, not to, frankly, talking patients out of clinical trials, which I think oftentimes is a concern, but actually, in fact, being a facilitator to phase 1 clinical trials and helping, for example, do symptom management while patients are on trial with the purpose of keeping them on trial longer. Because I think, we can have a certain level of optimism actually for maybe efficacy to demonstrate there, and certainly at minimum, safety. But I think for many patients, recognizing that participating in clinical trials is part of their own personal legacy through their cancer journey is an important thing to honor. I think it's also important to recognize which cancer populations are we applying some amount of implicit bias to. We know that there are certain cancer populations that are not approached for participation in early stage trials because of implicit bias, oftentimes by clinical research teams who sort of say, oh, that person, because of how they look, where they come from, their socioeconomic status, et cetera, is not going to be a right person for us to approach, which is the wrong thing. So we're after cancer health equity. We really have to look at every cancer patient and their caregiver as a person who is interested in hearing about clinical trials, and it's our responsibility to bring that up to them.
Yeah, that's a huge challenge. In the US, less than 3% of patients participate in clinical studies. And some of that is related to biases and access. Some of it's related to the fact that most cancer care goes on in centers that may not have a huge portfolio of studies. And as all these diseases have been broken down into more and more clinical subsets of diseases, it's been a challenge to maintain a portfolio of 70 trials so that you have one for EGFR lung cancer and one for ALK-associated lung cancer, one for IO for lung cancer, or one for each of the major sets of breast cancer and early stage and then late stage. That's 6 trials right there, and that's a lot of bucketing. But that's where the field has gone, and it's where it needs to go. And things that will expedite that will really have substantial impact. Also, it seems we spend too much time in some of the early phase developments worrying about side effects for drugs that have predictable side effects. So, for instance, we know that the 5th EGFR inhibitor or the 7th antibody against against HER2, like the trastuzumab, we have a good idea of what we're looking for, and I think we should be able to move faster. That's a very different story than a first-in-human or truly novel biologic or other approach to the whole thing. One of the challenges as an oncologist have historically been very satisfied with really modest incremental gains. And so, you need 1,000 people in a phase 3 trial because you want to not miss a 2 to 3% improvement. Well, maybe it's time that we raised our sights. And, again, historically in phase 1, we didn't want to miss a 10% response rate. It's probably okay to miss a 10% response rate. There are very few situations right now in oncology where you're going to be really excited about a 10% response rate. And I think that, if we push people a little harder to have, more expectations for their drugs, and to do whatever the early work is to make sure that we're talking about more impactful drugs, that too could, keep us from distracting resources and other things on drugs that really don't do all that much. And that speaks to what we were talking about earlier, which is really value in the oncology space at every level. But part of that is having drugs that are truly remarkable and active and powerful, and not so many that are just, barely squeezing the towel a little notch tighter to get some incremental benefit. Easier said than done, obviously, and there's still some cancers where anything is welcome, but there are fewer of those than there were just even a few years ago.
But in the past 2 decades, we actually have seen a number of the drugs that make so-called the milestone of a huge impact on the outcome.
Absolutely.
And I think that there will be more to come. I mean, I'm very encouraged by what our track record had been in the past 2 decades, thanks to molecular development, thanks to the so-called development in immunotherapy. And I certainly do see the trend is going to move forward that way.
Very much agree. The other thing I'm excited about is some of the work that's going on in molecular early detection for screening, if you will. And I think that one of the exciting opportunities, the Farber's gotten very excited about this, many people around the world, but looking at whether it's cell-free DNA or other biomarkers for early detection for cancers. There are so many success stories of this, but they're still limited. So there's breast cancer with mammography and obviously cervical cancer with pap smears. And in certain parts of the world, there's a lot of screening for lung cancer. Japan famously had their endoscopy screening for gastric cancer. Colorectal cancer screening should be universal, but there's still many, esophageal cancer and pancreatic cancer and ovarian cancer. We don't have those tools. So the idea that you could begin to find molecular tests for early detection, again, I think it would be one of those transformative issues. At AACR this week, there's a big study of chemoimmunotherapy for stage 3 lung, and it looks like a positive study, and it's exciting. But what we need is more stage 1 lung cancers, or ideally no lung cancers, of course. But if we're going to have lung cancer, we need to find them earlier. And when I see just at the population level what's happened in breast cancer, where the whole story is about early detection at this point, and then effective therapies for small tumors, that's where you really want to see things go. So I think that cell-free DNA and some of the other tools that are coming along for that kind of early screening detection could really be transformative in the next decade.
I agree with you. I think our next challenge is actually screening for lung cancer in non-smoker. I mean, you can imagine we cannot use the CT scan alone, because that will consume all the CT scan around the whole world if you start to screen for non-smoker. But then in complementary with the molecular diagnostic, I think we may be able to screen non-smoker for early detect lung cancer, especially in our part where when we have a lot of driver oncogene related, and those are the patients that I think we should focus on.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think multi-cancer early detection is a super exciting space, and what we have to play is an important leadership role here as oncologists, because oftentimes it's going to be primary care and GPs and others who are going to order these tests, and it's going to be as part of routine health maintenance, let's say in some future state. And as oncologists, we're going to have to be part and parcel with guidelines and quality measures and other sort of care pathways that are really going to help our colleagues in the primary care space figure out what to do. Like, what in the world do you do with a positive signal? And depending on the test, it may be some measurement of risk without an existing thing, right? Or you follow it up with a PET, you don't see anything on PET, but you've got a positive signal. And so there's going to be these gray areas that are going to start to show up. We as oncologists, I think, are very used to dealing with gray areas. We either have criteria or we have clinical knowledge, or we say, well, we'll just repeat the scan again in a few months and kind of see where everything plays out. But we have to recognize that there's going to be a lot of people playing in the oncology sandbox with multi-cancer early detection who don't have sort of what we do every single day in terms of, for example, dealing with uncertainty, overreading a scan, measuring things ourselves and putting them against criteria, using a way to objectify kind of exactly what's happening versus not. And so I think we play an important leadership role there in sort of how to interpret data, how to follow it up, and how importantly, to stay away from too many false positives, because that's going to be the thing that's going to derail a lot of excitement with any type of test like this, right? Is if we get the sensitivity off. And I think we play an important role in terms of how to sort of work through that. So I encourage all of us, right, as oncologists, to really lean into this space and not say, well, we'll wait till the patient comes to us, because our colleagues are going to need some direction from us about what to do with any sort of test that's anything but normal.
An interesting parallel, if you think about the public health aspect here, is in cardiology. So, mortality from heart disease has been steadily declining, and it's truly multifactorial. So part of it, of course, is that we can do coronary interventions and do stents and open vessels, but a lot of it has been primary care testing for high blood pressure or high cholesterol, and then managing those more vigorously. And that, of course, carries over into active cardiac patients as well. Some of it has been brand new drugs for heart failure and revised paradigms for that, and in extreme cases, heart transplant. But actually more of it has been diabetes management, smoking cessation, programs designed to alert the public to symptoms of a heart attack, even first-line responders with, defibrillators and things. And, when you start to add these up, you're at public health interventions, first-line responders, primary care teams addressing things, and then, of course, the more advanced cardiology piece coming in. I think that's a model for oncology, too, where we need to do more about lifestyle modification. We need to, why are people still smoking? It's crazy. It's the #1 cause of cancer still worldwide. So we have patients coming in, they all want molecular testing. Let me tell you, if you don't smoke, you don't need a lot of the molecular testing that we get for esophageal cancer, bladder cancer, and all the other things. And I don't think we've done a good enough job of really bridging that societal piece of pre-cancer care, prevention, and early detection with what we've done a very good job with in the past 20 years, which is advanced diagnostics and therapeutics for oncology patients. Ideally, we'd like to do less of that and more of the public health facing angles on this.
Well, guys, I really enjoyed the conversation with you guys, and I thank WuXi Healthcare for the opportunity for this conversation. Certainly, I hope that we can meet physically together, really drink over a glass of wine or coffee together, and to carry on this conversation. So thank you so much for this opportunity, for getting us together. Thank you.
The World Health Organization has declared that antimicrobial resistance is one of the top 10 global public health challenges that requires urgent action to achieve its Sustainable Development Goals. How can key players in the ecosystem work together to tackle this problem? What are some of the exciting innovations on the front line of this issue, and how can we accelerate these innovations? Please welcome Aaron Duffy, Chief of Research and Development, CarbX, Valeria Gigante, Team Lead, AMR Division, World Health Organization, Geneva, Switzerland, Timothy Jinks, Head of Infectious Diseases Interventions, The Wellcome Trust, Henry Skinner, CEO, AMR Action Fund, and Jenny Yip, Managing Partner, Adjuvant Capital.
Great. I think we're going to get started this morning. Well, thanks everybody for joining us. I'm really excited to talk about a really pressing global health challenge in terms of antimicrobial resistance. And look, I think all of us on this panel and participating in this conference recognize that this is a global challenge around antimicrobial resistance, and we need multifaceted solutions to tackle this massive problem. So I just wanted to start off with perhaps an easier question. I'm going to go around to each of my speakers and just ask what each of your organizations are doing with respect to AMR, and what are your respective top priorities. So Tim, I see you're on my first box on my screen, so I'm going to have you start first.
Great, thanks very much. And it's really a great pleasure to be able to join in this conversation because, AMR is one of the most important threats to global health. For Wellcome, we have a couple of priorities related to AMR. First is the priority associated with the pipeline of new products to address AMR and specifically antibiotics. The fact is that there is insufficient supply of effective antibiotics to meet the world's needs. We need innovation to deliver new antibiotics that can overcome resistance. So that's a key priority for us today. And this is something that needs to be done in a way that can be sustainable to address not only today's needs, but future needs. Alongside that, though, there are other things that need to happen to be able to control AMR for the long term. So we're looking at ways to mobilize the evidence to inform a full suite of actions, particularly that countries can take, so that there can be a complete and effective way of controlling AMR so that resistance does not pose a threat in the future, and that these endemic diseases are not ones that can escape control and reach epidemic proportion, which is what we're seeing when resistance leads to escape of control today.
So thanks so much, Tim. And Henry, you're next to my screen, and perhaps your organization speaks volumes in of itself.
Oh, thanks. I'm the CEO of the AMR Action Fund. We're a $1 billion venture fund focused on investing in private companies that are clinical stage, developing the next generation of antibiotics to treat the priority pathogens that have been identified by WHO and CDC of greatest urgency and unmet need around the world. We focus on clinical stage companies. We look to invest and find co-investors to progress their products. And we aim to finance companies and leads to the approval of 2 to 4 new antibiotics over the next decade.
Great, thanks so much, Henry. Valeria, how about you?
Thank you, Jenny. So WHO early this year published the 4th strategic priority to tackle AMR. Therefore, they talk about stepping up the global leadership for the AMR response. And here we have the Global Leadership Group, that is an advocacy group, and the quadripartite organization with FAO, OIE, and UNDP. We also intend to drive impact in every country through the implementation of a national action plan, the awareness campaign. The strategic priority number 3 is the one that I'm working in, it is promoting R&D, and I will tell you more. And the last one is monitoring the AMR burden through surveillance, and we have the glass network. As anticipated, my team works under priority number 3, that is R&D. So we set the global priorities, like in the bacterial priority pathogen list that is currently under revision. And we intend to release a new version by the end of this year, beginning of 2023. We are going to publish probably this spring, beginning of summer, the first fungal priority pathogen list. And we also conduct a pipeline analysis these are intended to guide R&D efforts towards the identified global unmet needs. And we have a pipeline analysis for antifungal, antibacterial, and vaccine against priority pathogens. We also have the secure projects to enable equitable access of antibiotics, and I'm sure we will cover also this aspect. And the CA list that aim to ensure that the critically important antimicrobials are used prudently both in the human and in veterinary sector under the One Health approach.
Great, thanks. And Erin, last but certainly not least.
Hi, so I represent CARB-X, which stands for Combating Antimicrobial Resistance Biopharmaceutical Accelerator. And so I think everybody else on this panel somehow, we are in service to. So we are a not-for-profit domiciled at Boston University and funded by 3 international governments, the US, the UK, and the German governments, as well as the Wellcome Trust and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Like Henry, we focus primarily on or exclusively on the bacteria identified by the WHO and the CDC as urgent threats. Our focus is upstream from Henry, so we focus on discovery and early development stage programs, and we cover treatments, preventatives, and diagnostics. The goal here, of course, as Tim said, is to build and maintain a pipeline of innovative products for today and tomorrow, so that as we turn to solutions that make this market again vibrant, we aren't stuck without ammunition that we can bring forward to patients.
Thank you so much, everybody. And it's actually quite amazing that this panel represents so many facets of the entire ecosystem, because you have investors early and slightly later stage, you have multilateral organizations, you have philanthropic organizations. And I think that goes into a broader theme of what we're all gathering here for in terms of partnerships. And so given that this is a global challenge and it's not going to be solved by one certain sector of the ecosystem, how do you think all these different players can better work together? Because obviously individually you have your priorities and your agenda, but how can you guys all work together in a way that can tackle this? And how about Valeria, I start with you in terms of the World Health Organization. You're probably the largest of them all.
Yes, thank you, Jenny. Here, well, our collective success is dependent on each other. And this means on the strength of our partnership, collaboration, commitment, and long-term investments. So collaboration for us is key to fight antimicrobial resistance. And we believe that we work with the global communities to achieve several things. First of all, to align investment around the identified priorities. Otherwise, we will find our resources against them. If we look at the current pipeline, 40% of products are beta-lactam BLI inhibitors combination. And most of them inhibits class A, C, and D enzymes, but only 3 agents inhibit class A. This means that we are dramatically unresourced against multidrug-resistant Actinobacter baumannii and the Pseudomonas aeruginosa. We also want to work with the global community to foster innovation for product development, for business model, and reimbursement mechanism. In addition, the collaboration should be to optimize and advance the new treatment options, because as isolated companies in this space don't have many chances if left alone. They need support from financial, scientific, and regulatory perspective. And we also want to keep working with the global community to support the global access to the market. In this way, we can ensure a viable economic environment and access for new and existing antimicrobial agents.
Great, thanks so much. And Tim, how about you at Wellcome?
Indeed, the fact is that we're facing a situation which suffers a crisis in implementation. And that's something that I think is very important here, that we actually know the things that need to be done. And it's more a case of how do we get on with getting the work to happen. And it's really key in this that we have better collaboration and coordination of efforts so that we are working together wherever that is useful and necessary, and that the work collectively is contributing toward common goals. So, we work actually with everyone that's joined here together in what we do. We certainly look to WHO, who provides a guidance function for the world and that global perspective on what the priorities are and where the key focal points should be on things such as research agendas, and as well, particularly, where the greatest need is in relationship to health and health impact. But we are a co-funder of both CARB-X and an investor in the AMR Action Fund. And these are platforms that actually do function as mechanisms for coordination in and of themselves. You know, structurally, that is a way to achieve better coordination. And that's part of the way that we think about it. And it serves as a role too, that we can collaborate with others on these common purpose activities. So, you know, I think that there are the approaches that we take in addressing these things is really important here, but we mustn't forget that it has to be done together. There actually is not a single sector, much less any particular entity in one sector, who's going to be able to deliver the silver bullet solution here. And that's an important thing, is that we need to look across sectors as well as different players and actors to make sure that we can get the best out of each other. And I think we've laid the good groundwork for that, but there's more to do, and certainly more that can be done as we look to increase the participation in these things, as well as having a slightly longer term perspective on what needs to happen. You know, AMR has been with us since the beginning of antibiotic usage. It's not going to just go away instantly. We need to have a 20-year perspective on what is it going to take to actually solve this and be able to control AMR and deliver all of the tools necessary to protect people's health. So collaboration, coordination, and a big long-term commitment is what we need to see.
No, absolutely, Tim. And it's funny because I think many of you, despite being from fairly different organizations, have talked a lot about kind of innovations and innovative tools and a longer timeline. And those two things are definitely the next set of topics I wanted to cover. But perhaps, and Henry, I'm going to call on you a little bit, because whenever we think about innovation, I think naturally we all gravitate towards product innovation. And that, of course, is very important to ensure that, you know, early stage technologies moves through the clinic and into patients. But what are some of the innovations that you have seen in your seat that really excite you? And again, these can be product innovations, business model innovations, or frankly, even funding model innovations. So, Henry.
Well, I think part of the answer to that's going to extend on what Tim was talking about around this continuum. You know, this is a global problem. We need to think about it globally. We know how small the world is and how resistance spreads across the world. We've seen that with COVID, where new variants are spreading around the world before we even know they exist, right? So this is an inseparable aspect of infectious disease and resistance. So I think that's kind of the first piece of that, this innovation of how collaborative this area is, you know, which I think is a function of both need and recognition of the scope of the problem and the long-term vision of trying to anticipate what we need and what we need to start building today, the sort of things Aaron's looking at very early in discovery, to what we will need in 10 or 12 years when those products can be approved, and how they will be used from there, you know, perhaps for the next century. If we look back at penicillin discovered in 28, right, we're still using this nearly 100 years later. And that speaks to the power of this field in antibiotics and their utility over a very, very long time frame, but also recognizing resistance does form. It's there in nature even before we develop the antibiotics. You know, this back and forth between various bacteria and natural product antibiotics and resistance has been going on 4+ billion years, and we're just playing catch up and playing on the edges of it. So I think that to me is one of the great innovations we have of great alignment, great transparency amongst people, a lot of discussion about what we need, what that looks like, target product profiles coming out of WHO, you know, feeding into Aaron's work as we look at products in the clinic, and then talking to clinicians and looking at patient need and how all these things line up. And let's remember that the scope of this problem is daunting, right? We've got 18, 20, 22 pathogens identified, more coming with the the fungal side. There's no one bullet here. There's no one cure that's going to end this. We need a steady state, ongoing stream of new antibiotics that are addressing these needs as they continue to arise. So I think that's probably the greatest innovation. I think there's lots of chemical innovation and technology, lots of interesting work coming in diagnostics that I think could be transformative as well as part of this holistic solution. Lots of discussion about how do we couple access to stewardship so that we have these tools available for the long term globally, and then reducing further resistance formation, et cetera. So I think there's lots of great discussion, lots of great movement around all of that. And I think the place where I think I'm most hopeful for innovation is around some of the pull incentives that are being discussed globally that could potentially fix the market and bring a fresh infusion of capital and innovation and scientists into this field and accelerate the breadth of what we do to make sure we have that pipeline.
Yeah, and we're going to touch a little bit on pull incentives later, but it's actually a really good point. We talked a little bit about timeline, and I want to circle back to that. And Aaron, given the X in CARB-X, I would love for you to answer this question. As we think about timeline for solutions, and going back to Tim's point about you need to have a 10 or 20-year mindset, I think of it as what are some of the low-hanging fruit solutions that we can try to tackle today to get some of those early wins? And then what do you think are some of these longer-term solutions that do require the 10 or 20 years? And importantly for you, how can we accelerate some of that work?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And it's something we think about a lot. We are in an environment where not exclusively, but most of the large pharmaceutical companies are absent in this space in terms of bringing forward discovery, new innovative, discovery programs into the clinic. And so who are left are very small companies. You might even call them micro companies. In some cases, this is a true story, 5 guys in a storage bin where there's a laboratory and they're bringing forward a really interesting idea. So our role is, yes, to support them with funds to bring the science forward, but importantly, to help them build beyond the technology, which is typically where they're expert, to build a team around them that understands how to bring these forward all the way through to early development. And this is critical, and we do it, so you talk about sort of low-hanging fruit. We're looking at programs today at various stages of development with degrees of innovation. I think innovation is in the eye of the beholder. So if it's a next generation product, but it has a twist, let's call it, an oral option of an antibiotic that can get people out of the hospital more quickly, or if it has some other innovation that's important for patients, these are things that we can advance. While we're bringing forward new modalities. And when I think about that, I think about, bacteriophage, live biotherapeutics, antivirulence programs. These are all highly innovative solutions that would definitely contribute to AMR in a way quite different from direct acting antibiotics. These are all things we need to be pursuing.
Well, thank you so much, Erin. And one of you said earlier about talking about stewardship, and I remember, Henry, I think it might have been you, but we often hear about kind of antibiotic stewardship, but I think sometimes we equate that with encumbered access or not wanting to use a product. So maybe, Henry, since you brought up the topic first, I would love for you to address that, and then Valeria from also the World Health Organization perspective as well. But Henry, please.
Sure. Stewardship in its purest form is really about getting the right antibiotic to the right patient at the right time. And it's that simple, right? You want to use an effective antibiotic for each and every infection. In some ways, it's that simple. The complexity is when you couple that or you have limited access and limited choices for physicians and an absence or inadequate diagnostics, that bring about a challenge of how do you deliver the right antibiotic to the right patient if you don't have it available and you don't know what to use. So I think these go hand in hand, and we need to think of them as a paired solution and effective that optimizes patient benefit, optimizes the long-term utility of these classes of molecules for long-term societal benefit, and delivers the greatest value. I think the other side of stewardship is really around limiting inappropriate use of antibiotics to places they shouldn't be used, be that agriculture, broad prophylactic or delivering antibiotics for what's likely a fungal infection without any sense of a bacterial reason. These are things that do lead to more resistance.
Valeria?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Jenny. As Harry was mentioning before, there is also this paradox that we want stewardship interventions, but we also want to ensure that patients receive antibiotics everywhere in the world. So it's the paradox that we have to deal with. We have clear tools to guide stewardship intervention, that is the WHO aware classification. So once a new antibiotic is approved, it's classified by WHO according to 3 categories. Is access, watch, and reserve, as the name suggests. Access are for first and second line empiric treatment of common infection, and we wish that they should be widely accessible. Antibiotics in the watch category have the higher resistance potential, and they should be applied only in determined circumstances. They should be closely monitored during their use, and they are the object of stewardship programs. And antibiotics in the reserve groups are the last resorts for XDR and MDR bacteria. They are valuable and non-renewable resources, so we should really preserve their use. While the implementation of the aware classification is important for stewardship intervention, we need to ensure a responsible use and prevent and preserve their effectiveness. A lot of work needs to be done to ensure access, and also to make sure that antibiotic in the reserve group will really be available when bacterial resistance will rise against other agents. So this urgently requires strategies to procure and reimburse antibacterial agents. And it was highlighted also during the last UK G7 presidency in the finance minister's statement to support antibiotic development.
Yeah, no, and thank you so much, Valeria. And I think you used the word paradox, which I think is actually very common in this space and some of the challenges that we're trying to solve. And I think you touched upon a second paradox as well, in terms of, the entire global health community wants novel antibiotics, novel chemical entities to treat some of these really infectious superbugs. But at the same time, to your point about being on the reserve list, we don't necessarily want to be using them all the time. So I think we talked about some of maybe a pull mechanism. Is that relevant here? Are there other things that are akin to pull mechanisms that we can think about? And Tim, I'm going to call on you first to answer that question.
Great, thank you. And indeed, it is a very important issue, because what we know and understand is that the antibiotics market itself is one that is broken. It doesn't work in a way that can sustain the necessary innovation, and much less deliver products throughout the world in the way that they need to be delivered. This issue about volumes as a driver for commercial returns is one that requires a delinkage. We don't want that the financial reward associated with the benefits that are generated is directly linked to volume of antibiotic usage. That is something that actually creates a perverse incentive that actually drives antimicrobial resistance and increases the problems we have. It also creates a lot of inequities in who gets access to the drugs as well, because it's actually becomes very financially driven and oriented. So we need models that de-link the returns on the products being made available and used where necessary from the financial returns that can be gained. And that's something that, I think we are at an exciting moment here. And I get excited about the financial innovation that we are seeing, and how the world is looking at, and in particular, specific countries are looking at ways to de-link the way that they are buying the medicines and making them available, and done with good stewardship, so that they're not simply pumping them into the system at the highest possible amount. So I'm going to focus on a particular example. In the UK, there is a model that is referred to as the Netflix model, because it's a kind of subscription model that would allow the National Health Service in England to have access on a subscription basis to new antibiotics. And it is one that very purposefully separates out the volume of usage for the income that would be received by the companies that are providing these drugs. This is really, really important. Now, it's a challenging notion, though, in terms of how do you value these products? What's a fair price? And there aren't the easy mechanisms and systems in place to say, this is a fair price we want to have here. But in the UK Netflix model, they've established a really good framework for looking at this, and one that can provide a method for evaluating, creating the valuation, and achieving delinkage. And they set out a set of principles that creates the acronym STEADY. And this is really important, I think, and this is where the innovation lies in these principles. Of course, the spectrum of the drug, what does it treat, is very, very important. That's a direct linkage to the value itself. That's kind of a classical notion. The ability to block transmission. Now, this is something that historically hasn't been looked at. This is something that is actually about a value across the health system. This is about the epidemiology of resistance. Further to that is the enablement value. And that's the enablement in terms of the broader healthcare provision in the system. It's not about curing a specific infection, but it's like, what do you do when you have a patient who's had a heart transplant and they need to be treated to be protected against the infections that might be the thing that would kill them, even though the transplant itself might be successful. Similarly, diversity of the agents that are approached, because we need diverse interventions that again reduce the drivers for resistance itself. And lastly, it's described as insurance. That's the I in STEADY. And that is, what is the value of having the antibiotic on hand when you need it? And this is, again, a very important aspect that is normally not looked at, not valued into the price. So these STEADY principles actually set out in the framework a way that we can establish a full value of the antibiotic, having it available to the system. And it's very different than the classical evaluation of, oh, we have this treatment. What are the DALYs or qualities it delivers in isolation on a patient-per-patient basis? And that's what we're going to call the number. So this is really exciting. It's really important that it's being deployed and tested today. And it's one model of a few that the world really needs to take up to see how can we break this market failure and achieve the delinkage that's necessary so that the stewardship that Henry described is something that is achievable.
Yeah, no, thanks so much, Tim. And Henry, I would love to hear your reaction to that as an investor, because the Netflix model, other pull mechanisms, they sound great, but is it enough for you and to incentivize you to make an investment?
I think Tim's exactly right. The question is, as we look around the globe and the total market, right? Because these are drugs needed everywhere. If the aggregate reward is sufficient to incent investment, and that's both capital that's needed to move these programs through discovery and development into patients. So if the aggregate of that reward, these Netflix subscriptions, as we look across countries, is sufficient in aggregate, and that's been estimated to be several $billions, then I think the answer is yes, capital flows back in. And the beauty of these is you're paying for success, right? You're paying for the successful development of the drug that clearly is going to have patient benefit, and frankly will be with us for a very, very long time, and with judicious use, virtually forever. And so what the UK has pioneered, right, at the right level, and if that is mirrored by other countries, if you will, at the appropriate level for those countries, and you look at this around the world, this is entirely within reason that these pull incentives can be of that stature to attract investment back here and to reward the successful development of these very necessary drugs. So I think it's a very exciting innovation. I think the thought around the totality of the value to society these bring, including the underlying value of the foundation for our healthcare systems that enable basic surgery through transplant, through oncology, autoimmune, et cetera, it is enormous.
Absolutely. I'm going to circle back to Aaron. I think something that you had mentioned in terms of COVID. And look, like we are still all living with it, living in the endemic, whatever you want to call it right now. But what are some of the lessons learned now that we're about 2 years in that potentially we can apply to the challenge that we're talking about today? Aaron, I'm going to have you start.
Yeah, actually, I think there are so many. And let me start at the basic science level. So the fact that within a year, or actually less, we had 2 vaccines with totally innovative platforms that could be deployed for COVID, very much, I think, encourages us to continue to be opportunistic about new science, new modalities, new approaches, and to invest in them now so that, again, we have a pipeline of solutions when we need them. So I think, number one, continue to focus on the basic science. Number two, and related to that, but upstream or downstream, somewhere away from that, was the innovation that was shown in the development, bringing these forward, the truncated regulatory path, not for the purpose of, not, appropriately addressing safety, but how do we modify the way we bring products forward in a way that can accelerate, them to the market. I think that's very important. The other things, I think, you can look on your cell phone, you can look, in the newspaper, you can look online, and you can find out today what happened yesterday in terms of, where Omicron was, or whatever the new Omicron is, and where the hotspots are, and who's vaccinated and where they're vaccinated. And those platforms now exist because we built them in a way that we should be able to track AMR in a real-time way. And I think that's very important. And then finally, what helped facilitate that, of course, was the build of rapid diagnostics. And now all over the world, including in low middle income countries, we have these diagnostic existing platforms that we can then take advantage of to build infrastructure for AMR diagnosis.
Thanks so much, Aaron. And Henry, I'm going to call on you next, simply because you're not on mute.
Fantastic. And I wanted to extend on something Aaron raised there, right? This aspect of surveillance around the world, so that we can anticipate and see the development of mutations and variants and resistance. This is something we've not done well enough in the AMR side. You've got some very good surveillance in some top hospitals in US and Europe and Japan, which is great, right? But we need this globally. We need to know what's going on everywhere as resistance is coming up. It takes 10, 12, maybe longer years to develop a new antibiotic. We need to see what's coming from the resistance mechanisms and epidemiology to really understand the drug product profiles we need to have in place a decade from now, right? We need to build for the future. And we only can do that to the extent that we understand where we are today and where the trends are. So this global surveillance is something that really needs to be expanded so that we have a very good sense of what's going on globally, so we can build the right products for be most efficient building the right products to have the greatest impact we can going forward.
Tim, I think you were going to add something as well.
Yeah, so I think that what Henry and Aaron said, completely agree, and just want to build on those. For example, in the case of surveillance, we not only need to build on the capabilities that exist today, but there also needs to be something of a paradigm shift in thinking about what the role is of surveillance and who it serves, the kind of information that needs to be gathered and how that can be made available. And, Aaron gave the wonderful example that we all can pick up our phones today and look at surveillance data related to COVID, as well as the deployment of interventions. And that is a big, big shift in thinking and understanding what you do with the data and how it's used. And we need to have this happen across the space of AMR in relationship to infectious diseases as well. A lot of the things are in place. It's a curious situation that in healthcare facilities throughout the world, patients are tested to see if they have an infection, often to see if it's drug resistant. That data often just disappears. It sadly is often not made available in a timely way to inform the treatment of that individual patient. But even if it does, it disappears at that point in time and doesn't feed into a broader perspective of understanding what's going on in each locality, as well as feeding up to have population-wide views and things where we can see the dynamics of these infectious diseases and resistance of these infectious diseases across different territories and over time. So we can do more and do it very differently with respect to the surveillance. And there will be much better informative value, both in terms of the treatment of patients, how hospital systems are prepared to be able to provide treatments, as well as informing the interventions that we need to be developing so that we can stay a little bit closer to ahead of the curve on making things available. I also wanted to add that a big change that I think COVID has introduced to us is understanding that the interventions here are public health interventions. So when we talk about vaccine deployment, that's clearly a public health intervention, but the use of diagnostics, for example, that is also a public health intervention. And yes, it tells you something about each person, but it also tells you about what's happening in populations. And this is what we need to build on and adopt in relationship to moving forward with AMR, because AMR is a public health crisis, and we need to make sure that the interventions here are ones that are oriented to address the public health needs as well as the needs of individual patients.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good segue into kind of looking towards the future and what we can all collectively do. And I'd love for each of you to answer this question, but if you had your own magic wand within your organization, what would you like your organizations to change or do more of? And Valeria, I'm going to pick on you a little bit on the World Health Organization, since you're the largest and perhaps you need the biggest magic wand.
Good question. I would like two things to work more in my organization and WHO. That would be ensure access, but at the same time, ensure the fragile antibiotic supply chain. I think that we didn't talk enough about this, but we should also protect the fragile market of the existing generics antibiotics. Most of them are available as IV formulation. According to the current GMP, they require to be manufactured, for instance, in a sterile environment, in aseptic preparation. So I think that we should really work to tackle this issue from a multilateral approach.
Aaron, what about you?
I think for us, the biggest thing that we can do more of is accelerate that X in CARB-X. So we have a very healthy program today. We have 50 active programs across treatment, prevention, and diagnosis. But how do we help them overcome challenges on an individual level and on a portfolio level so that we truly do accelerate them closer to patients and they can be then picked up by advanced developers and be made into drugs. And I think that's just something we need to, continue to do and do better.
Henry, how about you?
Yeah, I think I would love to see us have enough capital to support all of the innovation that's moving forward and really sustain a robust pipeline. I think to do that is really about the policy changes and the market reform that brings capital back in. And it's more than just capital. It's VCs that know how to build companies and hire and manage teams and set strategy and the like. And I think to have that capital come into the field is really about these market reforms, be they the subscription models such as that pioneered by the UK or others. And that'd be my magic wand.
Tim, last but not least.
Great. So since this is at the level of magic wand waving, first of all, what I would want is that we could transform the R&D ecosystem so that it can sustainably deliver the necessary products. This is something that is a critical threat that we have right now. We're doing a lot. I wish we could just solve it. And we really need to invite others in to help solve this particular problem. That is the burning platform for us right now. Alongside that, the other piece, though, is that I want to see a transformation in the approach and the systems related to infectious diseases so that we are able to control AMR for the long term. Let's move to a preventative approach, one that reduces the need for using antimicrobials in the first place. Yes, let's have them there when they're necessary, but let's take the pressure off the system and do all of the other things so that drug-resistant infections are a minority threat, not an increasing threat to people's lives.
So, as we wrap up here on this panel and replace your magic wand with your crystal balls for a second, but if we were to gather here again in 10 or 15 years' time, what do you think we're going to be talking about in terms of what we have already achieved? And what do you think are going to be some of the solutions going forward? Tim, I'm going to call on you.
Okay. Well, on that one, in 10 years' time, we will arrive to a place that the R&D ecosystem for new products is stabilized. We're not talking about market failures. We're actually talking about what's exciting in terms of the innovative science. That's the focus of attention, is the science and the research that people are pursuing. So that's the 10-year horizon that I'm looking for right now.
Great, thanks. Erin, how about you?
I agree. I think in my crystal ball, I no longer have a job. But seriously, because now we have people who, when they're, graduating college, want to go into areas of research that would allow them to identify and develop new AMR solutions.
Yeah. Henry, how about you?
I think in 10 years, we're going to see a movement of this field into personalized medicine, where we're really directing the right antibiotic to the right patient, and that's spreading globally.
Lastly, Valeria.
Well, in 10 years, this is what I wish. I would like to see all the global priority addressed. I would like to see that every patient everywhere in the world is reached by the right antibiotic treatments, and all basic surgery and procedures are enabled.
Great. Well, thank you very much again to everybody on the panel. It certainly fills me with a lot more hope than I previously had in terms of tackling this global health crisis. So take care, everybody, and thank you for your time.
Thank you all for a great first day of the WuXi Healthcare Forum. We hope you find discussions thought-provoking and the progress we have made exciting. We'll continue the forum tomorrow with the theme, Innovation on the Front Line. We'll center discussions on new approaches and new technologies that will enable us to bring better medicines faster to patients. See you tomorrow.